News of the Times, History's Forgotten Serial Killers, a crime compilation special. Welcome to News of the Times and this month's crime compilation special. This month's 2-hour descent into the darker corridors of true crime brings you chilling tales of killers who've slipped through the cracks of historical memory, from quiet poisoners to cross-border predators. These cases are grim, grisly, and mostly long forgotten. But we end with the final figure who didn't vanish quietly, the so-called Butcher of Lambeth, whose final words on the Canadian scaffold echoed something far more infamous. "I am Jack," and then the drop. A fitting finale to our month in the shadows of the Ripper. The cases in chronological order and time-stamped are: Case 1, the Shapwick Poisoner, 1845. Sarah Freeman, a woman whose fury knew no family bounds, left a deadly trail through Somerset, husband, children, mother and brother alike. Case 2, the Levesen Street Murders, 1849. A heavily pregnant mother, her 2 children and a faithful maid, all brutally attacked in the supposed safety of their Liverpool home by a charming lodger with a false name. The horror was so profound, the street itself was renamed in an attempt to erase the memory. Case 3. Serial Killer Children, 2 Elizabeths and a Mary, 1810, 1844 and 1867. From poisoned tea to vanishing siblings, these 3 children's tales of murderous women, some as young as 12, prove that even the most innocent faces can hide the darkest intentions. Brace yourself for a trio of tragedies steeped in arsenic, suspicion and youth gone terribly astray. Case 4. Catherine Wilson, the nurse with a penchant for poisoning, 1862. A trusted nurse turned lethal poisoner, Catherine Wilson left a trail of cared-for corpses and earned the chilling title of the female Palmer. Case 5. Serial Killer on the High Seas, 1903. Stranded at sea aboard a burning vessel, a tale of betrayal, mutiny and cold-blooded murder unfolds as 7 crew members vanish, their killers drifting towards safety with a plan, a lie and a lifeboat. Case 6. The Lambeth Poisoner, 1892. In honour of our Canadian viewers on this Canada Day, we turn to Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, born in Quebec, hanged in London. His crimes spanned continents, but it was at the gallows in 1892 that he supposedly uttered one final chilling confession: "I am Jack." And now, dear viewer, prepare to step into the chill, lingering mists of forgotten history, where shadows whisper, names fade, and crimes long buried rise once more to demand your attention. These are the killers time forgot, but you needn't. Case 1. The Shapwick Poisoner, 1845. We are in the county of Somerset in 1845. Notorious Sarah Freeman stands accused of the murder of her brother and mother, but there are more deaths associated with her, of 2 of her children and her husband. This famous case in its day was considered highly shocking, as Sarah clearly did not follow any of the rules of her day and was known for her exceptionally violent temper, not at all espousing the gentler lady-like qualities expected of women at the time. The village of Shapwick is situated halfway between the towns of Bridgewater and Wells, perhaps the most retiring and quiet village in the county, containing about 400 inhabitants. The population being mostly agricultural, there is no beer or public house in the village. It is here where Sarah Freeman, née Dimond, was born. Sarah Freeman, born Sarah Dimond in 1817. Sarah came from a poor but respectable family, her father being a labourer. She had one sister and two brothers. Sarah attended school near Glastonbury for 7 years, finishing her schooling at the age of 14. She was known to be clever at needlework. Sarah was always known for having a vicious temper. Once she left school, it is said she led a profligate and abandoned course of life, quite possibly prostitution. When she was approximately 18 years old, she had 2 illegitimate children. In the small community of Shapwick, Sarah's actions would have had a rolling impact on the family, bringing shame upon each member of the family. It was reported that both family and fellow parishioners pushed Sarah to leave her home and move away from Shapwick. After the birth of her second child, Sarah moved to Bridgewater, located approximately 10 miles away. Bridgewater and Henry Freeman. Here in Bridgewater, she continued the lifestyle she had chosen, prostitution, and lived there for 2 years. Rumours have it that within Bridgewater she and a clergyman had developed an improper intimacy, and she became pregnant with her third child. The story is told that the clergyman paid Henry Freeman to marry her and move away. Harry Freeman worked as a labourer in a tan yard. We do not know what the monetary prize was for marrying Sarah and taking on the role of father to her child by a clergyman, but he accepted the money, and the deal and the couple removed themselves to a small village called Moorlinch, and then on to Pedwell in September of 1842. From the Argus and Argus, January 18, 1845. From a somewhat early age, she is represented as having been addicted to loose habits, and before her marriage she had 3 illegitimate children. The tint of these was the fruit of an improper intimacy with the clergyman of the Church of England. This circumstance is said to have led to frequent differences between her and her husband, who married her at the insistence of the reverend gentleman, who gave a sum of money as an inducement. Pedwell, husband Henry and son James. Within Pedwell, the couple shared a cottage with Sarah's son James and a lodger, John Wake. After a few months, her child James was hit with violent stomach pains and vomiting. Cholera was rife during this time, and children dying was not so very unusual. James continued being tortured with violent vomiting and extreme pain throughout the night. He died the next day. 7 weeks later, husband Henry also started having violent stomach pains and incessant vomiting. The doctor came and prescribed medicine for him, but Henry died a few days later in extreme pain on the 27th of December, 1843. Henry was said to belong to a burial club, popular in the day, with a payout of approximately £20. From the Age and Argus, January the 18th, 1845. The first death which the accused is suspected of having caused is that of her husband, who died somewhere about Christmas, 1843. It would seem that he was in what is called a life and death club, which meet at a public house in Bridgewater, and is supposed that the pecuniary amount receivable upon his decease, upwards of £20, worth roughly £1,700 in 2023, formed a main inducement to the commission of the crime. A few weeks later, her daughter died mysteriously. Again, the illness involved tremendous pain in the abdomen area and persistent, violent vomiting. From the age and August, January 18th, 1845, murder by a woman of her husband, children, mother, and brother. In the March following, her little girl, the offspring of the illicit intercourse before referred to, then about 7 years old, was taken suddenly ill and died within a very short period. We are told that she was at her Sunday school, apparently in very good health, on the afternoon of the Sabbath day, and on the following morning was a corpse. It is said that the symptoms of her illness resemble those which would follow the administration of poison, great pain and violent cramps. From the money she received for her husband's death and possibly her children, Sarah moved back to Bridgewater, and there she opened a shop selling bread, bacon, and household foodstuffs. This lasted only some 4 or 5 months. Sarah sold off all the stock, had a quick foray to London, and returned to Bridgewater. Once again pregnant, Sarah sent a letter home requesting to be allowed to return to Shapwick. The reply was quick and blunt: no. From the age and August, January 18th, 1845. Sometime after this, the prisoner went away from the neighbourhood, it is believed, to London, and nothing was seen of her till about December last, when she returned to Bridgewater and sent a letter to her friends requesting to be allowed to return home. In reply to this, a refusal was sent by her now deceased brother, Charles. This Sarah did not take well, and a few days later went in search of the purchase of arsenic from the local chemists. From the age in August, January 18, 1845. On the 9th of December, she applied at the shop of Mr. Varder, a chemist in Bridgewater, for 3 pennies worth of arsenic. The person in the shop at first very properly refused to supply her with it, when she said she was at the sister of a carrier well known in the town, and then she required it for the purpose of killing rats and mice. Upon this representation it was supplied to her, care being taken to caution her as to its character, and to label the package with the word poison. Sarah returned home with both her mother and brother wishing her to leave. 3 days later, Sarah's mother, 72, became terribly ill with severe stomach pains and incessant vomiting. From the age in August, January 18, 1845. On the 12th, the mother, 72 years of age, but hale for her years, was suddenly taken ill, being seized with pains in the stomach, accompanied with violent retching. She lingered till the 14th, when she died, and was buried the Sunday before Christmas Day. With the death of their mother, Charles, Sarah's brother, insists that Sarah leaves the household. Sarah is pregnant and has no place to go. From the age in August, January 18, 1845. After this, the now deceased brother Charles positively objected to her remaining at home, and said if she did not leave, he would, as he would not lose his work on her account, and his master said he would not keep him to work for her. Considerable disputes followed this, and the prisoner was heard to say that her brother wanted to have his glee over her, and to bring born his Johnny, alluding to his intention to get married, but something would turn up for him. On the day after Christmas Day, the brother was in his usual health, and came home to his dinner, which had been prepared by her. Shortly after, he was suddenly seized with violent sickness and pains in his bowels, so that he could not go back with his work, and took to his bed. He remained ill till Monday following, during the night of which he died. During his illness he occasionally got better, but after taking the gruel which was prepared for him by the prisoner, Sarah Freeman, he grew worse and died. Sarah, whose reputation preceded her in the small community, was now under suspicion. Neighbours talked of the quick deaths of her 2 family members within 2 weeks of her return, and, of course, it was noted how convenient this was for Sarah, who had no place to go. Authorities became involved. From the age in Argus, 18th of January, 1845. In consequence of the suspicious nature of the symptoms, Mr. Phillips of Chilton super Polden, who was called in prior to his death, took out the viscera and carried it to Mr. Horepath, the eminent and analytical chemist of Bristol, who subjected the contents to various tests and succeeded in discovering arsenic in the intestines and the liver. A coroner's inquest was held on Wednesday at Shapwick on the body of Charles Dimmond, the brother, before Mr. Coles, coroner for the county, which ended in a verdict of wilful murder against Sarah Freeman. Prior to this, an investigation took place by Edward Seeley, O.H. Strangeway, and J. Worry, Esquire, county justices, residing in the neighbourhood, which led to the exhumation of the mother. This took place in the presence of the 2 first-named magistrates, Mr. Herapath and others. The viscera of this body was also handed over to Mr. Herapath, who succeeded in finding arsenic in the stomach. With the discovery of arsenic from a celebrated in his time chemist, Sarah is arrested, remanded, and an inquest takes place where the initial evidence is produced to see if she should be put forward to trial. The prisoner was then charged with the wilful murder of her mother, Mary Dimmond, but the necessary witnesses not being in attendance, the inquiry was adjourned to Saturday, when the jury returned a verdict. The prisoner was charged at the late assizes with the murder of her husband, child, mother, and brother. The bills against her for the poisoning of her husband and child were ignored, in consequence, we believe, of the absence of Mr. Herapath, the chemist. Those for the murder of her mother and brother were found true. She was convicted upon that of the brother. The prisoner purchased arsenic at Mr. Varder's at Bridgewater on the 9th of December last, and returned to Shapwick the next day. On the following Thursday the mother was poisoned and in a few days died. About a fortnight after, the brother also died from the same means. The prisoner, having used threats against the mother and the brother for not giving their consent to her return home, led to the suspicion that they had not died from natural causes, which turned out to be too true, and an inquiry soon presented a case against the prisoner which placed her guilt beyond all doubt. Persons after this hinted that the husband and child, who had died rather suddenly about 12 months before, had been observed to exhibit similar symptoms to those of the mother and brother. Their bodies were consequently exhumed, and the contents analysed by the celebrated Mr. Herapath of Bristol. Arsenic was found, and their deaths no doubt caused by arsenic. The motive assigned for the commission of these crimes is that the brother and mother had expressed themselves most strongly against the prisoner's return home, and a determination that she should not remain, but the prisoner, Sarah Freeman, being anxious to do so, believing herself again with child. The motive for the destruction of the husband and child we have not heard. The prisoner, Sarah Freeman, who is short in stature, somewhat square-built, and of a rather mild expression of countenance, did not appear to manifest any anxiety. She sat unconcernedly eating some raisins which were given to her by Mr. Bustle, the gaoler, and the only time at which she seemed at all moved was when her father was called as a witness. On Wednesday last, the prisoner was charged with poisoning her brother, and at the conclusion of the inquiry, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder. The prisoner said, "I am not guilty of it. My brother ought to be committed as well as me." The bodies of the father and child have been exhumed, and the contents of the stomach handed over to Mr. Herapath. That gentleman, we understand, has detected arsenic in the child, and has very little doubt but that it exists in the father. Both Sarah's other brother and father testified against her in court, and Sarah was found guilty. Normally, with execution looming, most prisoners would accept the sentence and begin to prepare their soul for their death to come. Sarah did not. Her behaviour was considered outrageous at the time, and an example of how very wicked she was. From the Taunton Courier and Western Advertiser, April the 23rd, 1845. Life and execution of the diabolical murderess Sarah Freeman. We now come to the conduct of the criminal since her incarceration. Upon sentence being passed on her in the impressive manner by Judge Coleridge, who told her that the evidence was most clear and conclusive against her, and that there was not the slightest doubt either upon his mind or in the minds of the jury of her guilt, the prisoner exclaimed violently against both, and was removed from the bar to the van, uttering violent invectives, and declaring that all the witnesses had sworn falsely and were actuated by feelings of animosity against her. She was condemned on the 5th of April. On the morning of the 10th she expressed a desire to the governor and the chaplain to make a statement, as she said, for the purpose of easing her mind. Instead of confession, which was expected, it was a tissue of falsehoods, totally exculpating herself and insinuating that the deaths of the mother and the brother were caused by the hands of her brother, John, who appeared against her in the trial. She stated that the arsenic had been purchased by her for the purpose of self-destruction, and that the brother had taken it from her. Although this statement was not believed, yet, as it was contained many particulars which could be confirmed or contradicted by persons uninterested living at Bridgewater and Shapwick, the governor of the prison immediately visited those places, saw the persons alluded to, and found not a word of truth in the whole statement. The wretched woman has persisted in this statement to the last moment of her life, and although she has again and again said she had no hope of being saved from making it, it was quite clear from observations which dropped from her that her idea was that as no person could prove the actual administering of the arsenic, and as she had been convicted upon circumstantial evidence, there was a chance of her escape if she did not confess. Mr. Coles, the under-sheriff, has seen her several times and remonstrated with her. She has behaved to him almost uncivilly. Of her father, when spoken of, she exclaimed, "I wish he had been crumbled to dust before he was allowed to appear on trial." The brother above alluded to paid her a visit on Monday last week, and we are informed that during the interview, forgetting entirely her situation, she became as violent as ever, and that the meeting presented a scene not easy to be described. Combined with all this extraordinary feeling, she was most vain of her personal appearance. Her height was hardly 5 feet, a repulsive countenance and very stout, an eye most prominent, and, when excited, most remarkable for malignity of expression. Previous to her trial, she was very particular in getting up her dress, but it will hardly be believed that on Friday last she made herself a cap to appear in on the morning of her execution, saying to one of the matrons, who was remonstrating with her for applying her thoughts to such matters, "I am not going there, a perfect fright." On Sunday, the condemned sermon was preached by the chaplain. A more suitable, solemn, and affecting address was never uttered from the lips of any clergyman. The whole of the females surrounding the wretched condemned woman were crying and sobbing bitterly. Indeed, all in the chapel were affected to tears. But will it be credited that no tear dimmed the eye of her who had the most cause to feel, but that she sat unmoved and calm, as if an ordinary service were being performed? The service was concluded by a prayer, composed by the chaplain, calling on all to pray for forgiveness for the wretched criminal, who still sat quite unconcerned. Monday last she asked permission to dispose of her clothes to the prisoners with whom she had been classed previous to her trial. This being granted, she immediately wrote the names of the articles and the persons to whom she wished them to be given. She rather courted than avoided allusion to the crimes with which she had been charged, and of which she had been convicted, invariably protesting her innocence. Yesterday she was much depressed, but at times conversed with the governor quite cheerfully, and told him in the evening she had no fear of the hour of her execution, her only fear being that she may not receive forgiveness hereafter. She expressed her gratitude for the indulgence which she considered she had received, but which are afforded to all similarly situated in this jail. She was attended night and day with 2 females, and to a late hour last evening by the chaplain and governor, and retired to rest between 10 and 11 o'clock. Execution. This morning, the unfortunate creature appeared to feel the horror of her situation more deeply, for the first time almost. She shed tears, weeping bitterly, exclaiming to the governor, or parting with him, "I die innocent. I hope the Lord will receive my soul." This she also persisted in to the chaplain on his leaving her on the scaffold. The under-sheriff had an interview with her immediately before the service, and in the kindest manner entreated her, for the sake of her friends, the public, and herself, to clear her conscience by confessing before she died. She resolutely replied she had nothing more to confess, but that which she had already stated. The drop was erected during the night, and at an early hour this morning a number of persons congregated in front of the jail. There were hundreds by 9 o'clock. It is supposed that between 14 and 15,000 people witnessed the awful end of the unnatural, remorseless, and unpitied wretch, whose accumulated iniquities must be ranked amongst the foulest in the criminal annals of this kingdom.
She walked to the scaffold without the slightest assistance and declared her innocence in the most emphatic manner. In an hour she was cut down and buried within the precincts of the jail. Sarah Freeman was executed on the 23rd of April, 1845, by Calcraft.
Case 2. The Levesen Street Horror, 1849. The ghastly, brutal crimes of Levesen Street, Liverpool, were infamous in its day. A crime so horrific in the annals of the city that the name of the street was forever changed after the crime. It is 1849. A respectable wife of a seafaring sea captain in her 8th month of pregnancy and with the care of 2 small children aged 5 and 3 is brutally beaten by a fireplace poker and tongs, as is her live-in maid of 5 years, Mary Parr, and her eldest child. Her youngest boy of 3 is found hidden in the cellar, his throat slashed. He is quite dead.
On March the 28th, 1849, 20 Levesen Street was the scene of one of Liverpool's most gruesome murders. So horrific were the crimes there that the city would end up changing the name of the street to Grenville Street South from its original name of Levesen Street. Background. Anne and John Hinrichsen lived at 20 Levesen Street with their 2 young children, Henry, 5 years old, and John Alfred, 3 years old. John Hinrichsen was an English sea captain. As such, he was away from home much of the time. Pregnant Anne decided to let out one of the rooms in her house to bring in a bit of money. It was a fateful mistake. A young gentleman from Limerick, claiming to be a ship's carpenter, called in regarding the suitability of the room. John Gleeson Wilson, whose real name was Morris Gleeson, liked the room and paid 1 week in advance. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of April 1849, the Levesen Street murders, discovery of the murder. The house in which the dreadful deeds occurred is situated in Levesen Street, number 20, 4 doors from Great George Street, a highly respectable part of the town. The family consisted of Mrs. J. H. Hinrichsen, who was within a month of her 3rd confinement. 2 sons, Henry George, about 5 years of age, and John Alfred, a fine little fellow, 3 years old, and Mary Parr, the servant girl in her 30th year. Mrs. Hinrichsen is the wife of Captain Hinrichsen, commander of the ship Duncan. He sailed hence from Calcutta in September last, and is now, it is supposed, on his passage home. He is an Englishman. She was herself well educated and a proficient in music, in which she gave lessons to her more immediate friends, having been often heard to say that as her husband worked hard, she saw no reason why she should not employ her time and her talents for the benefit of her rising family, and in the hope of assisting in making a provision for old age. It would appear that from the same prudential motive she was anxious to let some rooms, and had a card with apartments upon it in the window. On Tuesday afternoon, between 3 and 4 o'clock, John Gleeson Wilson, the man now in custody, called at the house. After looking at the apartments, he agreed to take the back parlour and the top front bedroom. He said his name was Wilson/Gleeson, and that he was a carpenter in the employ of the Dock Estate, at a salary of £2 10 a week, and as a reference he said his sister kept the Tranmere Hotel. At about 8 o'clock in the evening, Wilson returned and ordered tea. This refreshment having been supplied to him, he partook of it apparently very heartily. He spent the remainder of the evening in the house. About 10 o'clock he sent for a pint of ale, and after drinking that, retired to his bedroom. Although he said he expected his luggage up any moment, none made its appearance. The day of the crime. Mrs. Hinrichsen went out to market to make some purchases, leaving her 2 boys in the house with the maid Mary Parr and new lodger Mr. Wilson in his rooms. Mrs. Hinrichsen ordered some potatoes for delivery, as well as 2 jugs from a different shop to be delivered to her house within the hour as she made her way home. A young girl arrived for her planned music lesson, met with silence. She discerned faint moans emanating from within. The young delivery lad also arrived with the 2 jugs. Hearing the moans within, he pressed his eye to the keyhole and beheld a pair of feet sprawled across the hall. Swiftly, the lad hastened for assistance, returning in the company of a constable. They discovered that concerned neighbours had already breached the door. The grim tableau unfolded before them. Mrs. Hinrichsen, accompanied by one of her sons and the maid, Mary Parr, lay in a ghastly tableau of blood. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of April, 1849, the Levesen Street murders, discovery of the murder. At about 11 o'clock on Wednesday forenoon, Mrs. Hinrichsen went out to make some purchases, and amongst other places called at the shop of Mr. Cox in St. James's Street, where she bought a quantity of potatoes. Anthony Carney, a boy in the employ of Mr. Cox, was immediately dispatched to the house in Levesen Street with the potatoes. On ringing the bell, the door was opened by Wilson, who took in the basket and closed the door, leaving Carney outside. Having thrown the potatoes, as now appears, into the front parlour, Wilson opened the door again and returned the empty basket to the boy, who immediately went away. At the moment the vegetable delivery boy was leaving the steps, a witness observed Mrs. Hinrichsen coming up Levesen Street from Great George Square, and before he had proceeded far, he saw her enter her own house, the door of which had apparently not been closed by the man inside. About 11:30 o'clock, Mrs. Hinrichsen had called at the shop of Mr. Roebuck at St. James's Street and purchased 2 jugs. She wished the boy to go along with her, but as he had some work to finish and knew the house, having been there the previous evening, he said he would follow her, and he did so in about 10 or 15 minutes. On arriving at the house, he rang the bell and knocked several times. Finding that no person answered either the knocking or the ringing, he peeped through the keyhole and saw the legs and feet of a female lying across the lobby. Looking through the front parlour window, he saw the servant and child lying on the floor, and immediately hastened for his master. About this time, a young lady pupil of Mrs. Hinrichsen came up to the door and rang and knocked several times. Not gaining admittance and hearing the moans, she became alarmed. She was observed by Mr. John Hughes, a bricklayer, who was at the time going to his dinner. He got over the railing and, peeping through the front parlour window, saw the servant lying bleeding on the floor, her head covered with blood and her hair flying all about. The eldest boy was also lying on the floor, his head apparently under the servant and his arms around her waist. Several men coming up Hughes broke a pane of glass, removed the catch from the window, and entered. He was soon followed by other men, and a police officer, Henry Howe, and others. The appalling spectacle which presented itself to the men who entered was sufficient to overcome with horror the stoutest heart. 3 human beings were lying on the floor, literally weltering in a pool of their own blood, their skulls and faces smashed and mutilated in the most frightful manner. The wife of an absent husband, and who expected in a few days again to become a mother, lay with her head inside the parlour door and her feet across the lobby. Her hair was dishevelled, her features distorted, her hair and face covered with gore, and blood was still streaming from her fractured head. In the middle of the floor lay the servant girl, and near the fireplace the eldest boy. When Hughes entered, the servant girl raised herself up on her arm and stared wildly at him. They were all alive, but dreadfully injured. No time was lost procuring medical aid, and Mr. Martin was soon in attendance. He was followed by Mr. Slater, and as the victims still breathed, they were ordered immediately to be conveyed to the Southern Hospital. A car was procured, and the 3 were taken off directly to hospital. From the statement of the girl and other circumstances, it is evident that the servant and the eldest boy must have been rendered insensible before the arrival of the boy with the potatoes. It would also appear clear that immediately upon Mrs. Hinrichson's entering the house, she must have been attacked by the man, and so effectual had his first blow been that not a scream was uttered, or at least none sufficiently loud to attract the attention of the neighbours. Her bonnet, her veil, her victorine and comb were covered with blood, and her gloves were still upon her hands. The weapons used by the monster in human shape to effect his dreadful purpose were 2 pairs of tongs, a shovel, and a poker. In the parlour, the poker, shovel, and a part of the tongs were found. They were clotted with blood, and portions of hair adhered to them. Some idea may be formed of the force of the blows dealt upon his victims, when it is known that the poker, which has an unusually large and heavy handle, is much bent, and that both tongs were shattered and the bottom part of the shovel broken. One portion of a pair of tongs was found in the cellar kitchen. The weighty ends of the tongs and a poker had been used against the heads of the poor sufferers. One of the tongs was broken off at one side of the bow, the fractured edges rugged and sharp. With this hooked and heavy weapon, some fearful blows must have been inflicted. As the rugged edge is covered with hair, blood, and apparently a part of the brain, there can be no doubt it had been used. The servant girl must have been attacked while she was attending to her household duties in clearing the front parlour grate. The fender was removed from its usual position, and the black lead brush and saucer were close by the grate, the latter, when discovered, being partially filled with blood. The eldest boy, at the moment of the murderer's attack, appears to have been innocently amusing himself in the parlour, for his almost lifeless and still bleeding body was found encircled by his hoop on the floor. On further searching the house, blood was traced down into the kitchen. The walls and stairs were besmeared with it. Between the 2 kitchens, a large pool of the sanguineous fluid was also found, but this, to prevent observation, had been covered over with a large mat. In a small pantry or closet out of the back kitchen was discovered the lifeless corpse of the child of 3 years old, the head nearly severed from the body, and by its side, besmeared with blood, lay a large table knife with which the fatal wound had been inflicted. The boy was dressed in frock and petticoats, and even in death a smile seemed to play upon his innocent face. It was, indeed, a sad and heart-rending spectacle. On going upstairs, some of the drawers and boxes in Mrs. Hinrichson's room were found disturbed, and a small box containing jewellery had been forced open. Police, in searching through the house, discover Wilson's room with marks of blood and a clear attempt to have washed bloody hands or clothes in the water basin, still filled with bloody water. The hospital. Mrs. Hinrichson, with multiple contusions on her head, clung to life for 6 days before dying. She remained insensible throughout. Henry, the 5-year-old child, had been so terribly beaten his brain matter was exposed in several places. One of his fingers had been cut off and was attached to his clothing. It was thought that it had been cut off from the ferocity of the attack as he tried to protect himself. He died in hospital the same afternoon. The youngest child, John Alfred, had had his throat cut to his backbone, the vertebrae being the only obstacle to its complete decapitation. Mary Parr, the maid, was badly beaten but conscious. A few days later she was able to give an account of the events of the day in the presence of clerks for the magistrate as she lay in bed at the hospital. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of April 1849, the Levesen Street murders. Statement of the servant girl on Friday at the Southern Hospital in presence of the prisoner. Mary Parr. I lived as a servant with Mrs. Hinrichson at number 20 Levesen Street, Liverpool. Her husband is at sea. Mr. Wilson, who is now present with the hat on, took lodgings at Mrs. Hinrichson's for a month. He came on Tuesday night. My mistress went out the next morning to market between 10 and 11 o'clock. I was cleaning the front parlour. My mistress had 2 children. The eldest was Henry George Hinrichson and the youngest John Alfred Hinrichson. The younger was 3 years old on St. Patrick's Day and the older was 5 on the 8th of May. The children were left in the house with me when my mistress went to market. They were in the front parlour when the mistress went out. The prisoner came from the back parlour to the front in a few minutes after my mistress went out. He had a newspaper with him when he came in. He asked me the price of the set of fire irons and of the fender and of the card tables. He hit the children on the head with the newspaper in fun and sent them out of the room. But the eldest opened the door again, and the prisoner had the tongs in his hands to ask me the price of them, and I was cleaning the shovel. He then struck me with the tongs somewhere on the head, and I don't remember anything more except that I was lying there. The children were in the room when he struck me, but where they went afterwards, I don't know. I never saw my mistress after that. I was sitting right faced to the fireside when he struck me. I think I remember nothing more afterwards. I was in the middle of the room. I had lived nearly 5 years with Mrs. Hinrichson, and I had been at Mr. Aitken's office lately, where I received £10 for Mrs. Hinrichson. Mrs. Hinrichson carried a green purse. She wore a watch and a chain outside. I think Mrs. Hinrichson's purse was an opener-worked purse like the one now shown to me. The watch, chain and seals now produced are Mrs. Hinrichson's. The prisoner had no luggage with him, but he said he was expecting it. My mistress wore her watch, but I don't know whether she wore it that day or not. She put it under my bed at night that I might see what time it was to get up to get the breakfast. I am 30 years of age next birthday, and the prisoner had no money. He borrowed sixpence from Mrs. Hinrichson, and I got it from her. The prisoner only slept one night in the house. The prisoner was then asked if he had any questions to put to the witness, and he replied that he had not. The attempt to cover his tracks. Wilson, having gone through drawers in the house to find money and valuables, attempts to cover his actions. He attempts to wash his blood-stained clothes. He returns to his real lodgings within the city, where his landlady gives him a clean shirt. He goes to a pawn shop to hand in his wet, soiled clothes and purchase a new set of clothing. Although not needing a shave, he goes to a barber requesting a close shave and asking about obtaining a wig, stating that his hair is thinning. He looks into the costs and schedules for steamers travelling to the United States. Throughout all of these actions, he is noticed and remembered, partly because of his mannerisms and profuse perspiration, and partly due to the unique hat he insists on wearing. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of April 1849, the Levesen Street murders, the proceedings of the prisoner after the murder. From the time that Mrs. Hinrichson went out to make her purchases until the whole family were discovered so cruelly butchered was only about an hour could have elapsed. Of and from the circumstances of the witness going to his dinner at 12 o'clock, the time has been pretty accurately ascertained. About 12 o'clock, or a few minutes before the discovery of the murder, the prisoner was seen by two of Mrs. Hayhurst's carmen, who were standing near the top of Levesen Street, to walk hastily from the direction of the house up Washington Street. He was perspiring profusely. He took off his hat and wiped his face with his handkerchief, and his appearance attracted their attention. He wore a dark blue plaid sporting coat, light corded trousers, and one of the legs of which was pulled up and over his quarter Wellington boot, and he had crape on his hat. Mr. Kane, a plasterer, in passing across a field at Windsor before 12:30 o'clock, observed a man dressed as before described come up to the pit and wash his shoes and front of his trousers. The prisoner, when going up Washington Street, was proceeding in the direction of Windsor. This proceeding on the part of the man struck Mr. Kane as rather singular, but he thought no more of it till informed of the murder, when the occurrence he had witnessed again flashed across his mind, and, by the advice of a friend, he reported what he had seen to the police. Accompanied by a police officer, Mr. Kane returned to the pit, and at the place where he saw the man washing, he found a handkerchief with which the fellow had wiped his bloody clothes, and also a letter which had been delivered that morning at the house by Macdermot. The letter was addressed to Mr. John Wilson, No. 2, Levesen Street of Liverpool. The real number of the house is 20. The writing, when subsequently compared with the letter sent by the prisoner to his wife, was found to correspond exactly. The capture. One of the items that Wilson had recovered from the murder house was Mrs. Hinrichson's gold watch and chain. Wilson, approaching a respectable pawnshop, attempted to sell the gold watch for £8, eventually settling for £6. The canny owner of the shop, having heard of the crime and sensing that Wilson was not the type to own a gold watch himself, instructed his son to guide Wilson to the police station under the ruse of getting a receipt for the watch. While Wilson and his son were traversing past the Bridewell on Dale Street, the son seized Wilson and presented him before the authorities. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of April 1849, the Levesen Street murders. At 8:30 the same evening, the prisoner called again at the shop of Mr. Samuel and agreed to take the £6 for the gold watch. He was asked to write a receipt, but said he could not, and as the suspicions of the elder Mr. Samuel were aroused, he talked in Hebrew to his son and told him to get the prisoner to the police office. The prisoner was then asked to go to another shop in Dale Street for the purpose of getting a receipt signed. When nearing the police office, he appeared inclined to run off, but Mr. Samuel kept close to him and pushed him in. The police, looking at the man who had been brought in, immediately thought of the murderer that they were trying to locate. Wilson is questioned and held on suspicion based on his answers. With Wilson held, police immediately find the witnesses, those who had all described Wilson running away oddly from the house at the time of the murders, those who saw a man attempting to wash his clothes in the nearby pit, the barber, and the mother of Mrs. Hinrichson to see if she could identify the watch Wilson had been attempting to pawn. Wilson is positively identified by all of the witnesses, and the watch is identified by the bereft mother of her pregnant daughter clinging on to life, albeit in a state of insensibility. From Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of April 1849, the Levesen Street murders. The prisoner was searched by police, who found a purse and some money upon him. Every answer he gave tended to confirm the suspicions that he was the person wanted. Mr. Clough immediately sent for Macdermot, to whom Wilson had spoken when he gave the letter. He spoke positively to him and picked him out amongst 8 others. The mother of Mrs. Hinrichson was sent for to the house of Mr. Parsons, Mill Street. Having arrived from Hull the same day, he identified the watch offered for sale by the prisoner as the one worn by her daughter. One of the workmen also picked out the prisoner amongst 14 other men, but said he should not like to swear positively to him till he saw him with a hat on. A constable was dispatched to Poster Street, and soon afterwards returned with the hat and crape upon it. The hat was shown to the prisoner, and he said, "That is mine, I'll prove it." He put it on his head, and a great change in his personal appearance was perceptible. He seemed quite different. Mr. Superintendent Clough, having cautioned the prisoner, told him he was charged with the wilful murder of 2 children, and he replied, in a half careless, half impetuous manner, "I am satisfied to stand my trial for it." Mr. Commissioner Dowling immediately ordered the prisoner to strip, and he was found to have 3 shirts on. One of them had lately been partially washed about the sleeves. Stains of blood were upon his neckerchief. He said he bought the purse at Bristol, that he was a fitter, and that he was a native of Limerick. When Mr. Dowling took off the cap from his head, the prisoner seized hold of it and said, "That's mine. I paid for that with my own money. The shirt which he took off in the morning was found at the washerwoman's, stained with blood. When asked where he got the trousers, the prisoner said, "That is for you to find out." Under police guard and with the permission of the doctors at the hospital, Wilson is brought before the maid, Mary Parr, still holding on to life and consciousness, to see if she can identify him. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of April 1849, the Levesen Street murders. On Friday morning, heavily ironed, Wilson was taken up in a car to the Southern Hospital for the purpose of ascertaining whether the servant girl could identify him. The medical officers of the institution were in attendance, and after consulting with the poor girl, who expressed the desire to see the man, gave it as their opinion that no evil would result from allowing her to see him. When she was informed that she would be allowed the opportunity of identifying him, she seemed anxious for the time to arrive, and when he should be brought up. The mayor and Mr. Rushton and Mr. Jameson, the magistrate's clerk, were also present. The prisoner walked into the room accompanied by several other men, and the moment the girl's eyes rested upon him, she said in a clear and distinct voice, "That is the man with the hat on." The rest of her evidence she gave in the most collected manner, without evincing the slightest agitation. The prisoner betrayed no outward emotion, except that he burst into profuse perspiration on leaving the hospital. It was with the utmost difficulty the ruffian could be preserved from the crowd assembled, who evinced their feelings by hooting and other demonstrations of feeling. Mrs. Hinrichsen, along with her eldest son, succumbed to their injuries in the hospital. Mrs. Hinrichsen had been 8 months pregnant. The maid, Mary Parr, although teetering on the precipice of life, managed to identify Gleeson before her demise 6 days later. 4 had been brutally, viciously murdered. Pregnant Anne Hinrichsen, her 2 sons aged 5 and 3, and the maid, Mary Parr. The trial. Throughout the trial, Gleeson exhibited a conspicuous absence of remorse, yet in the days preceding the hearing, those in proximity to the police cells recounted tales of his incessant screams and unbridled fits of rage. Wilson's defence was a blunt refusal of his guilt. He had made a vague attempt to create an alibi for himself. One was through his beaten, then abandoned wife, who refused to visit him, and the other was through a publican of a pub he had visited the following day after the crime. Neither alibi attempt was successful. The barbarity of the killings and the numerous witnesses who could attest to his actions, as well as the very compelling story told by the battered maid, Mary Parr, left the jury little doubt as to his guilt. The weight of the compelling testimonies rendered the jury's deliberation unnecessary. They swiftly reached their verdict without requiring to break. In keeping with his stubbornness at his trial, even with overwhelming evidence and no real response, Wilson refused to admit guilt or confess. The execution. In the solemn confines of Kirkdale Jail, before a throng of 50,000 spectators, Wilson faced the gallows. Some had journeyed on special trains from Lancashire, parting with a shilling for the macabre spectacle. The stand-in hangman, a septuagenarian named George Howard, miscalculated the drop, and improperly placing the hood, Gleeson's eyes bulged. His face turned a ghastly purple, and he writhed for a torturous 10 minutes before drawing his final breath. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 18th of September 1849, the execution of John Gleeson Wilson, alias Maurice Gleeson. On Saturday last, the curtain dropped on the closing scene of the most appalling Levesen Street tragedy. Maurice Gleeson, passing himself as John Wilson, the most foul and bloody of murderers and the most obdurate and hardened of criminals, forfeited his life by the hand of the public executioner in front of Kirkdale Jail. The wretch who wantonly imbrued his hands in the blood of Mrs. Anne Henrichardson, her 2 boys, and her servant maid, and then sent them with a babe that never saw the sun without a moment's warning into the presence of their Maker, now occupies a felon's grave. No criminal ever left this world so utterly execrated and abhorred. The perpetration beyond all doubt of a crime the most horrible and unnatural. His guilt proved as never in so serious a case guilt was proved before. He was not even left to society and to those he had so sadly bereaved a confession of his crime, which was the only thing in the way of reparation he could have done, and the greatest proof he could have given of contrition for the offences for which he was condemned to die. If ever there was a criminal deserving the highest penalty of the law, the murderer of Mrs. Henrichardson was that one. It will be recollected that when the awful sentence of death was pronounced against the prisoner, the crowd assembled outside the court gave an exulting cheer which was echoed throughout the adjoining streets. From this it was assured that some great demonstration of feeling would be made when the prisoner was led out to the scaffold. During the whole of Friday it was found necessary to keep policemen on the spot. At 6 o'clock in the evening a considerable crowd had collected, and many of them evidently settled down for the night to secure a good position in the morning and to witness the operations of the workmen in erecting the scaffold. Early on Saturday morning crowds continued to pour onto the ground. As the day advanced, the streets leading in the direction of the jail were unusually thronged with persons on their way to see the execution. There was a great influx of strangers from a distance, and for their accommodation we understand a special cheap trains at a shilling for each passenger were on hand. As the hour approached, the crowds increased until they were presently a number variously estimated at from 20 to 150,000 persons. Our estimate is there were probably about 50,000 present. A little before 12, one of the officers of the jail made his appearance on the platform, and having opened the second iron door, all eyes were directed toward the scaffold. In a short time, the culprit made his appearance. A suppressed murmur escaped from the crowd. The white cap was on his head, and this at first sight made his face appear pale, but it was not so. He looked less anxious than he did the morning of his trial. With a steady eye and firm gaze, he calmly surveyed the vast multitude before him, and not a nerve appeared to move. On reaching the scaffold, the priest knelt down within the drop, and the prisoner knelt also and had to be lifted again by the executioner. He then stepped down upon the platform, and followed by the priest, who continued in audible and earnest prayer. The executioner had some difficulty in reaching with the hook the link of the chain. When this was accomplished, the noose of the rope was at the left side of the prisoner and had to be moved. The changing of its position under the right ear was very roughly done, and apparently gave the culprit some pain. The executioner retired, neglecting to pull down the cap over his face. For a few seconds the crowd had a full view of the culprit, as he stood pinioned and powerless, the halter round his neck, and adjusted to the beam, his lips only moving as he followed the priests in their prayers. As the clergyman stepped back, they raised their voices. The criminal raised his voice with theirs. It was an awful moment, and in the midst of these loud and earnest supplications, the bolt was drawn and the drop fell. There were convulsive struggles, a hideous sight. Unpitied and unwept, the murderer finally ceased to live. As the cap had not been drawn down, the frightful distortions of the countenance were observed by the crowd. As the drop fell, all was stillness around the scaffold, but in the distance a slight cheer was heard. At 1 o'clock, the executioner, assisted by another man, proceeded to cut the body down. As the lifeless corpse was being carried within the walls of the prison, a loud cheer was given by the crowd, and one person called out, "Give me a piece of the rope!" Thus ended the life of John Gleeson Wilson, alias Morris Gleeson. The memory of the horrific death of Mrs. Hinrichsen and her household stayed in the public memory in Liverpool for many years to come.
Case 3. Serial Killer Children. 2 Elizabeths and a Mary, 1810, 1844 and 1867. In this episode, we are exploring 3 historic cases of serial killer children. Due to the age, we have lowered the bar of kills or attempted kills to 2 for the label of serial killer. Our first case takes place in 1810 in London. Elizabeth Hinchcliffe, 14, and in service to a family, as was the norm of the time, is finding the 2 children in her care trying. Elizabeth allegedly finds a way to deal with those irritating children. Our second case takes place in 1844, and 12-year-old Mary Johnson stands accused of killing her 2 brothers as her family try to understand what has happened. And our last case takes place in 1867, and Elizabeth Wheeldon, 17, is allegedly looking for a way to decrease her workload.
Elizabeth Hinchcliffe, 14, 1810. 14-year-old Elizabeth Hinchcliffe is in service to Mrs. Anne Parker. Being in service at this young age was not unusual at the time. There are references to Mrs. Anne Parker running a type of daycare similar to baby farmers, but legitimately. She has taken into her care as servant Elizabeth Hinchcliffe. There is testimony referencing the poor home life Elizabeth was in before the kindness of Mrs. Anne Parker taking her in. Not unusual at the time, the house had a rat problem in the basement, and arsenic was the usual remedy. A request for the arsenic is done through a letter, with Elizabeth being tasked to take the letter to the chemist's and return with the requested arsenic. From here, strange things begin to happen. From the Pilot, London, 22nd of September 1810, Old Bailey. Elizabeth Hinchcliffe, a girl of 14 years of age, was capitally indicted under the statute called Lord Ellenborough's Act for feloniously administering poison to Mrs. Anne Parker of Tavistock Row, Covent Garden, with whom she lived as a servant. and also to Christopher John Stanley and Samuel Smith, 2 children who boarded with the protectrix Mrs. Anne Parker on the 16th of August last, with intent to murder them. Mrs. Parker stated that the prisoner lived with her as a servant, and that some short time before this transaction, in consequence of the prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe telling her that the lower part of the house was overrun with rats, she sent her with a note to Mr. Midgley, a chemist and druggist in the Strand, requesting him to send her some poison for the rats. He accordingly sent her a small parcel containing about 2 ounces, which the prosecutrix Mrs. Anne Parker put into the back locker of a large writing desk in her shop. On the evening above mentioned, she desired the prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe to bring up tea, which she did, and then sent her out with some halfpence to buy some mortar to mix with glass in order to lay over the rat holes. While the prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe was out, she cut some bread and butter for the children and poured out tea for herself and them. The children drank theirs, her own stood until it was nearly cold, and she drank it off and immediately perceived a burning sensation in her throat and her stomach, which she conceived to arise from pepper by some accident put into the tea. The sensation increased violently. She filled up another cup to drink in hope of alleviating the symptoms, but fortunately was prevented from drinking it by one of the children being suddenly seized with vomiting, which she first attributed to having overeaten itself, and then the other child was affected in a like manner. In a little time her own sensations increased, and she thought she felt that they had reached her backbone. Shortly afterwards the prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe returned, and she asked her if she had put anything into her tea, and if she had, to acknowledge it immediately, as she could get something from the chemist's to bring up what she was swallowed, and there should be no more said about it. The prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe positively denied that she had. The prosecutrix Mrs. Anne Parker then said she hoped the prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe had not been playing any tricks with the parcel from Mr. Midgley's, the chemist. This she also denied, and told her if she would look at the parcel she would find it just as the gentleman had given it to her. The prosecutrix to Mrs. Anne Parker then went and examined the parcel, and was convinced it remained just in the same state as she had received it, but still perceiving the symptoms increase and being seized with a tremor, she said there was no time to be lost, and she took the parcel and set out for Mr. Midgley's, but was taken so ill on her way that she was afraid of dying before she could get there, and that the children at home would also die, and no one would ever discover the cause. She, however, with great difficulty, reached Mr. Midgley's and showed him the parcel, told him what had happened, and he made up some medicine, which he immediately administered to the children, and they were soon recovered. She herself took some medicine, but a fortnight elapsed before she was quite recovered. Mr. Midgley stated that in consequence of the note from Mrs. Parker and the desire of the prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe that he should send more poison than he had sent on a former occasion, he packed up the 2 ounces and gave it to her. And examining the parcel returned by the prosecutrix, he found that it contained less by 1/4 of an ounce, and that it had been opened and not tied up in the way in which he had tied it. He was convinced that the symptoms apparent on the prosecutrix and the children were the consequences of swallowing mineral poison such as arsenic would produce. He examined the tea in the pot. It had a metallic taste. He procured some more of the tea, which was not Chinese but British herb tea. He infused it with some arsenic in water, and found it had the same taste and appearance with that in the teapot of Mrs. Parker. This case made most of the papers, but was more of a back-page story than a headline story. From the Kentish Gazette, the 25th of September 1810, Old Bailey. Elizabeth Hinchcliffe, a girl the age of 14 years, was indicted for administering arsenic to her mistress, Anne Parker, with intent to poison and murder her. The evidence of Mrs. Parker stated that the young girl at the bar was taken by her from her parents with a view to bring her up in a better state than a common servant. That the prisoner Elizabeth Hinchcliffe in August last complained that the kitchen was overrun with rats and advised her to get some poison to destroy them. She sent her to Midgley's, a chemist in the Strand, with a note to procure some arsenic. This the prisoner brought home, and it was put into a bureau where the prisoner knew it was and had access to it. The morning of the 18th of August, the mistress perceived a strange taste in her first cup of tea, and she was going to take a second cup, but declined, as she was soon afterwards seized with vomiting and all the symptoms of mineral poisoning. 2 children who had also had some tea were seized with the like symptoms. She accused the prisoner having put poison in her tea, but she denied it and said she would find the paper in the same state which was given to her from the chemist. Mr. Midgley was next called, who proved the sale of the arsenic to the prisoner, and that he afterwards examined the parcel, and that it was not in the same state which he had made it up, but that it had been opened and a part of it taken out. He afterwards mixed it with some of the same sort of herb tea which Mrs. Parker had drunk, and it tasted just the same as that which remained in the other pot. The girl in her defence stated, "My mistress ill-used me." The jury, after some hesitation, found her guilty, but they and the prosecutrix recommended her to mercy on account of her youth. With the verdict of guilty and the recommendation to mercy, including a recommendation from the mistress who she tried to poison, Elizabeth's death sentence was commuted to transportation. And on May the 9th, 1812, Elizabeth boarded the convict ship the Minstrel, and she arrived in New South Wales approximately 4 months later. Our second story involves the youngest of this set of child Borgias with Mary Ann Johnson, who was 12, 1844. Information on this case is sketchy and incomplete, so we are only able to surmise certain aspects of the case. 12-year-old Mary Johnson is the daughter of a mother who has married again. Her married mother had 2 sons with her stepfather, and we can only surmise that Mary Johnson is expected to look after her 2 siblings whilst her mother and stepfather are away. From the Wiltshire Independent on the 29th of February 1844, murders by a young girl. On Monday evening last was committed to Lincoln Castle for trial at the ensuing assizes, charged with the wilful murder of her 2 little brothers, Mary Johnson, a girl not yet 13 years of age. The prisoner, 12-year-old Mary Johnson's story is as follows. She went to Mr. Overton's shop, the chemist, and asked for a pennyworth of arsenic, which, after a great deal of hesitation, she obtained. The same night, when partaking their meal, the 2 children were poisoned and died early the next morning, within 2 hours of each other, William the younger having expired first. On the night in question, Farr, the father, and his wife, upon their return from chapel, found the two children at a neighbour's house under the same roof, and labouring under all the alarming symptoms, retching, purging, and vomiting, consequent upon poisoned by arsenic, which continued without interruption until they died. On the day after the death of the two children, the father, hearing that the prisoner, his daughter, had procured poison from Mr. Overton's shop, took her with him and confronted her with Mr. Overton, putting the question, "Did this girl get any poison here?" Being answered in the affirmative, the father then asked the girl what she did with it. She replied, "I gave it to a woman on the road who sent me for it." And after vigilant inquiry by the officers and police, no such woman as she described can be found. Mr. Cummack, a surgeon, made a post-mortem examination on both bodies and detected arsenic in the stomach of both of them. The housekeeper underwent a very severe and trying cross-examination by the coroner, but nothing could be elicited from her or the father to incriminate anyone but the unfortunate prisoner, and upon the coroner's address to her upon the verdict, and the painful duty which devolved on him in sending one so young in years to prison and to trial, she appeared to be the only one in an unusually crowded court who remained unmoved, indifferent, and mute. At another stage of the investigation, being asked by the coroner if she should know the woman again or could describe her dress and person, she answered she had never seen her before or since, but that she was a tall woman wearing a brown cloak, a white straw bonnet with coloured ribbons, and carrying a reticule basket, and that she accompanied the woman on the high road as far as the guide-post leading to Butterwick, being a distance of between 200 and 300 yards from Mr. Overton's, where the woman left her and pursued her journey towards Boston, and the girl returned home. After vigilant inquiry by the officers and police, no such woman could be found. At this stage of the proceedings, a witness was produced who completely refuted the statement of the prisoner, and swore that on the day in question she was going on to the high road to Boston and saw a woman coming over Mr. Overton's stile, and that she also saw the prisoner, but that they never came near to one another, and that no communication did or could take place between them. Mr. Overton proved serving the prisoner, Mary Johnson, with 1/4 of an ounce of arsenic, and he asked her how they were going to use it. She said to poison mice. He advised the girl to be very cautious where she put it, as it was highly dangerous, and then took the precaution of duly labelling it with the word poison. Mr. Cummack, surgeon, made a post-mortem examination of both bodies and detected arsenic in the stomachs of both of them. Tuesday night, a report is prevalent that the youthful murderess, now in our castle, has made a confession to the Reverend Mr. Richter, the chaplain, which implicates other parties. We have searched the archives, but have been unable to discover how this case progresses, other than the last small article stating that she has confessed and implicated others. Whether this refers to the mysterious unknown woman or another, we do not know. From the Leeds Intelligentsia, the 30th of March, 1844, Mary Ann Johnson, a girl not yet 13 years of age, committed to the Lincoln Assizes for the wilful murder of William and David Farr, was discharged in consequence of the indictment not containing the word felonious. It is possible, if she did indeed do it, she got away with it. We find no trace of her after partially due to her very common name. We end this episode of Serial Killer Saturdays with the story of Elizabeth Weldon, 17, in 1867. This interesting case from 1867 may have been influenced by the famous Fenning case of 1815. The Fenning dumpling case of 1815, generally regarded as a travesty of justice and covered by News of the Times, caused a ripple effect for some time, with cases that came forward of servants poisoning their master or mistress. In this case, Elizabeth Weldon is in service to a farmer and his family. She has been in this position with the family for approximately 6 months. The couple have 7 children, the oldest being a girl of 12. Part of Elizabeth's duties included helping to look after the 2 youngest children, Martha, aged 1.5 years, and Joseph, an infant. The farm has had a known rat problem, and arsenic mixed with oatmeal has been left out in bowls around the farm in the evenings and then taken up in the mornings. This practice has not always been successful, with several of the chickens dying as well as one of the dogs, so the practice is stopped. The arsenic package is left on a higher shelf so that the children cannot access it. But the 2 youngest previously healthy children die, and in a manner that looks suspiciously like having been poisoned. From the Illustrated Police News, the 18th of May, 1867. Alleged murder of 2 children by poisoning. Alfreton, Derbyshire, Tuesday night. One of the most remarkable cases of alleged poisoning of 2 children has been under inquiry today. The excitement consequent upon the known and still more upon the suspected circumstances of the case being most intense. The alleged facts are as follows. On the 19th instant, Joseph, the infant Joseph of Joseph Tamlinson, who is a farmer at Sherland Delves, about a mile from the town, died after an illness of only 5 hours, having been attended to by Mr. Turner, the surgeon of this place, who was suddenly called in, but who could, as it was stated, only account for the death as resulting from convulsions, and the child was accordingly buried. On the evening of Monday the 22nd, another child, aged 2 years, was seized with vomiting and faintness, dying within about 36 hours after first being seized, and in this case also Mr. Turner attended the child but could not in any way account for the death, and an inquest was opened by Mr. Bushby, the coroner of North Derbyshire, consequent upon which the stomach and its contents were sent to the Professor Taylor of Guy's Hospital for analysis. Arsenic being found, the body of the other child was exhumed, and the stomach also sent to Dr. Taylor. In the interim, inquiries were set on foot, which resulted in the apprehension of a servant girl named Elizabeth Weldon, who was taken before Mr. Morwood, the magistrate, and remanded. The adjourned inquest on the 2 children was resumed this morning by Mr. Busby, the county coroner, at the George Hotel. Mr. Peach, from the office of Mr. J. D. Smith, solicitor of Derby, attended to watch the case on behalf of the girl Weldon. Superintendent Ryan of Alfreton and Detective Sergeant Davis of Derby, who apprehended the girl, were present on behalf of the police authorities, by whom the arrangements for the press and public were amply and considerably made. The coroner, after the jury had answered to their names, said he proposed to take the evidence as to the youngest child, Joseph the infant. The first witness called was Joseph Tomlinson, father of the children, who described the illness of the child Joseph, which was at first apparently not serious, but soon much worse. When he came home from chapel in the evening, that he sent the girl Wealden for the doctor. The child got worse and died before 11 o'clock. His wife nursed it. She told him the girl Wealden had given it some sausage. There was some arsenic in the house he had brought to kill rats. He had 5 children living, all older than the deceased. The oldest was 12, and in answer to the coroner, he said she was tall for her age and might have been able to reach the arsenic where it was placed. But he had told his wife and servant to be careful, for when he put some in the barn to kill the rats, the fowls got in and some of them died. The witness then detailed at great length a quantity of perfectly irrelevant information, the only point of interest or importance being that on the day the child died, the girl Wealden had been scolded for staying out till 9 o'clock instead of returning at 6 o'clock, and both witness and his wife had rebuked her for her improper conduct, and speaking to the younger children about her intimacy with men and how many lovers she had. It was on Good Friday that she, Elizabeth Wealden, was told that her father said the best thing would be to send her to Derby jail for a month if she would not do her duty. That was a few days before the second child died. A new hat was also missed and found destroyed in a cupboard that belonged to the child Martha, since dead. Anne Tomlinson, the wife of the last witness, gave evidence at great length as to the conduct of the girl Wealden and the symptoms from which the child had suffered. Mr. Taylor reported the results of his analysis, which was to detect arsenic in the stomach and intestines submitted to him for examination. There was no indication of disease or natural causes to account for death, which he attributed to the administration of arsenic. This related to the child Joseph. As to the other child, Martha, Dr. Taylor reported to the same effect. The stomach and intestines contained arsenic, which would account for death, and no other cause for death could be detected. After some further evidence by Dr. Taylor, who said he never had 2 clearer cases of poisoning by arsenic than those under inquiry, the coroner said he was obliged to attend another case a few miles away, and after some discussion it was agreed to adjourn the inquest till Friday. The inquest lasted nearly 8 hours. The inquest continued a few days later. It established that the paper in which the arsenic was held has a hole in which was not there before. Unusual behaviour of Elizabeth is recounted in terms of her breaking the usual pattern of when the children are up and dressed and where they are taken up in the house. The father also comments on the perceived lack of care on the other part of Elizabeth when the second child, Martha, 1.5 years, is taken ill. Lastly, it is reported hearsay that when asked if she was not sad that the children were dead, Elizabeth's response was, "No, I shall have less work to do." The inquest jury returns a verdict of wilful murder against Elizabeth, and she is committed to trial. Things would seem to be looking bleak for Elizabeth as she goes to trial. From the Times, the 25th of July, 1867. Crown Court. Elizabeth Wealden, a girl aged 17 years of age, was indicted for the wilful murder of Joseph, the infant child of Joseph and Anne Tomlinson. Mr. Stephen and Mr. Cave appeared for the Crown. Mr. T. Blackburn and Mr. Mellor defended the prisoner. The deceased, Joseph Infant, was born on the 6th of last March. His father is a farmer at Sherland Delves near Alfriston, in this county. And in the beginning of April, his family consisted of himself, his wife, their 7 children, of whom the eldest, a girl, was 12 years of age, and the prisoner who came into their service in the end of last January. The child Joseph was of a healthy constitution. On Tuesday, the 9th of April, the mother was left home with the deceased child Joseph and the prisoner, the other children having gone to school at 9 o'clock, and the husband having gone to Alfreton at 11 to attend the county court. After the other children had left for school, the mother prepared some sago with milk and sugar, and having taken some herself, placed the remainder in a teacup in the living room for the purpose of giving it to the child when it had been dressed. At noon, however, as it was dressed, the child went to sleep, and the sago remained unconsumed. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the mother went out of doors to bring up some clothes to dry, leaving the child asleep on the sofa. After an absence of 10 minutes, she returned and found the prisoner walking about the living room with the child awake in her arms. Mrs. Tomlinson asked the girl, who said that the child had begun to cry, why she had not given it the same sago in the cupboard. The girl said she had done so and pointed out the teacup empty. Her mistress complained that she had given the child too much, as the cup was nearly 3 parts full, notwithstanding the child appeared very hungry and took the breast eagerly. It then fell asleep, and so remained until 6 o'clock, when it awoke up and was sick, and after a little while it appeared better and dozed again. Waking up a second time, the child vomited again and appeared to be in great pain. It continued to suffer until about 8 o'clock, when Mr. Turner, a surgeon of Alfreton, was sent for. On coming to the child and making inquiries, Mr. Turner was led to believe that the child was suffering from indigestion in consequence of too much sago having been given to it, and having recommended a warm bath, he left, promising to send some anti-spasmodic medicine. The medicine duly arrived, but at the interval the child had become much worse. The vomiting and purging increased greatly, the limbs twitched convulsively, and the eyes rolled. The child struggled, then grew weaker and weaker, and finally died between 10 and 11 o'clock on the same evening. Subsequently, in consequence of suspicions excited by the death of another of Mr. Tomlinson's children, Martha, aged 1.5, the body of the infant was exhumed, and on the 7th of May, the viscera was taken out and forwarded to Professor Taylor of Guy's Hospital for examination. It was then discovered that the whole of the viscera contained arsenic in large quantity. The arsenic. It turned out that some time about the middle of January, Mr. Tomlinson purchased some arsenic, which had been coloured with an imitation of smoke for the purpose of killing rats. The arsenic was kept upon a shelf in the cellar at such a height that none of the children could reach it, but the cellar door was not locked, and any member of the family who could reach the shelf could get at the poison. After it was purchased, the poison was used from time to time down to the middle of March by mixing portions of it with oatmeal and placing it on a plate about the house or at outbuildings, leaving it there the last thing at night, and removing it again the next morning. Somehow or other, however, some fowls got to the plates and poisoned themselves on one occasion, and a dog did the same upon another. On the latter occurrence, Mr. Tomlinson was much put about, and cautioned the prisoner and another woman who was in the house washing against the careless use of so dangerous an article. Although the use of the arsenic was discontinued, its place was not changed, and it was still kept on the shelf in the cellar, accessible to any grown-up or intimate with the house. The trial of evidence. For the purpose of connecting the prisoner with the crime, it was shown that she had admitted to having administered sago to the children at about 3 o'clock on the day of its death, the only occasion on that day, according to the evidence of the mother, when anything was given to it except the breast. The mother having given it no food all day, and the other children having been away from the home from 9 o'clock in the morning until after the child was taken ill. The arsenic in the parcel on the shelf was coloured blue, and in the stomach of the child a similar colouring matter was found. The motive was suggested to be a desire to be rid of the trouble the children gave, and a witness was called who deposed to a conversation with the prisoner, in the course of which she expressed satisfaction at the death of the child, as it would no longer give her trouble. The summation. His lordship is summing up, commenting that of the evidence bore very slightly against the prisoner, and, but for the fact that she had given the sago to the child, was quite consistent with her innocence. As for the sago, if that contained the coloured arsenic, it was rather strange that none of the witnesses noticed any colouring matter either in the child's vomit or in the cup which had contained the sago. Elizabeth Wealdon was found not guilty and released. The deaths of the 2 children remained a mystery. Elizabeth was, of course, released from service to the family. Did she or didn't she? We believe that had it not been for the Fenning trial, which was well remembered for decades after 1815, Elizabeth would have been found guilty.
Case 4. Catherine Wilson, the nurse with a penchant for poisoning, 1862. Beneath her prim exterior and soft bedside manner, Catherine Wilson harboured a deadly secret. Known in the press as the most prolific female poisoner in Britain, Wilson was a nurse by trade and a murderer by calculated opportunity. Her patients came to her ill and anxious. Many left only in coffins. Over a period of years, she positioned herself as both caregiver and beneficiary, using her role to gain the trust and often the wills of those in her charge.
Catherine Wilson was born in 1822 and hanged on the 20th of October, 1862. Catherine must have had considerable charm, as she managed to get away with murder the first time. Whilst the first trial had been underway, police had been busy and had exhumed her other suspected victims. The autopsies proved them all to have died of poisoning. Catherine was then rearrested immediately and tried for a different murder and again for poisoning. What is especially interesting in this case is the length of time before she got caught. She was actually eventually convicted of a murder she had committed 6 years prior. Her most recent murder, which had ended in a not guilty verdict, led the police to look more closely into Catherine's past. We have few details of Catherine's early life. She has been described from Harper's Weekly on the 20th of November 1862. On Monday, October the 20th, Catherine Wilson met a doom as righteous as human law ever inflicted on a criminal whose deeds quite equal the atrocities of any malefactor on record. From the age of 14 to that of 43, her career was one of undeviating yet complex vice. Catherine Wilson was as foul in life as bloody in hand, and she seemed not to have spared the poison draught even to the partners of her adultery and sensuality. Catherine's crimes were outlined in the broadsides, 1-penny single-sheet papers handed out on execution day. These papers were just in financial reach of the poorer population. From our research, there are some discrepancies with dates and also Catherine's actual relationship with her many victims. Some papers refer to the males who died as her paramours, others refer to Catherine's position as either a nurse or a domestic servant. We recount the paper articles as they appeared. There are some slight discrepancies within the various papers. From the broadsides, 1862. This morning, the Old Bailey was again a scene of excitement, owing to the extreme sentence of the law being carried out on the body of Catherine Wilson, a criminal of the most horrible class. It will be recollected that the prisoner was tried last at the Old Bailey Sessions for the murder of Maria Soames by poison in 1855, who resided in one of her own houses in Alfred Place, Fitzroy Square, for which crime she was found guilty and has now suffered the extreme penalty of the law. Peter Morn, 1853. It appears that about the year 1853, the prisoner employed as a domestic servant as a person named Morn, who lived in Boston in Lincolnshire, and that this person was in habit of taking colchicum. He made his will in the month of April, and by that will he left her the whole of the little property he possessed. He died in the month of October following. James Dixon, common law husband, 1856. In the year 1856, we find that she was living with a young man named Dixon, and that they came to London and went to lodge with Mrs. Soames. Dixon was suddenly taken ill with violent vomiting and purging, and his symptoms were exactly the same as those exhibited by the unfortunate woman, Mrs. Soames. Dixon died shortly afterwards. The prisoner, Catherine Wilson, herself declared that he died of rapid consumption, but, on his body being opened, his lungs were found perfectly healthy. Mrs. Jackson, 1851. About the year 1851, we find that she, Catherine Wilson, was in the habit of visiting a Mrs. Jackson, who resided at Boston in Lincolnshire. Catherine was aware that Mrs. Jackson had drawn from the bank in that town a sum of £120, and that sum was in her possession. Mrs. Jackson was taken ill with the same symptoms and died in 4 days. After her death, the money was nowhere to be found. It appeared that on this occasion Catherine Wilson produced a promissory note apparently signed by 2 persons in Boston for the amount that was missing, £120, but it was proven that those signatures were forged. Mrs. Atkinson, October 1860. In the month of October 1860, we find that Catherine Wilson was connected with a Mrs. Atkinson, who resided at Kirby Lonsdale, and that Catherine came to live with her at her residence in Kennington. It appears that Catherine became aware that Mrs. Atkinson was in possession of a considerable sum of money. On the 19th of October, Mrs. Atkinson was taken ill. Again, it was the same symptoms of retching, violent purging, vomiting, and great agony, and in 4 days she was dead. If Catherine had been acquitted upon the charge of poisoning Mrs. Soames, she would have been tried for the murder of Mrs. Atkinson. Mr. Taylor, 1861. In 1861 we find she was living with a man named Taylor. He was attacked in the same manner, with the same symptoms of retching, violent purging, vomiting, and great agony. Fortunately for him, remedies were immediately resorted to, and he recovered. The attempted murder that brought down Catherine Wilson was Mrs. Sarah Carnell, 1862. Catherine Wilson worked as a domestic servant, nursing the ill health of Mrs. Sarah Carnell. She made a will, and by that she said that Mrs. Carnell left a sum of money to Catherine Wilson. Catherine brought her a soothing warm drink, urged Mrs. Carnell to drink it, stating, "Drink it down, love, it will warm you." Mrs. Carnell took a taste and spat it out as it burned her mouth. It was noticed that a hole was burned into the carpet where the liquid had touched. Mrs. Carnell survived this murder attempt, and police were called in. Tests were run, and it was found that the soothing draught that Catherine had given Mrs. Carnell contained sulphuric acid in an amount enough to kill 50 people. Catherine escaped to London, where she was caught and arrested. To the surprise of everyone, Catherine was found not guilty. Her defence that the acid must have been given to her by mistake from the pharmacist cast enough reasonable doubt for Catherine to be acquitted. However, police had been busy, and Catherine was immediately rearrested for the murder of Mrs. Soames. From the Broadsides, 1862. Again, we find that only in the present year, 1862, she was tried at Newgate for an attempted murder by the administration of sulphuric to a woman in whose house she resided. She was acquitted upon this charge, but though this was the case, there is too much reason to believe she was guilty of this crime also. These facts, we regret to say, render it extremely probable that the startling statement by Dr. Taylor is correct, and that in the midst of apparent prosperity and obedience to the law, dreadful crime and vice is rife in the metropolis through the destruction of life by secret poisoning. The history of this wretched woman reveals a long career of crime, so secret and appalling that it is almost impossible to think of it without a shudder. A crime of this sort involves almost all of necessity, a certain amount of intimacy, if not of close friendship, between the murderer and the victim. The demon of destruction must stand at the bedside in the guise of a friend, watch the tortures inflicted with a simulated sympathy, and have the opportunity of repeating them, till nature can bear no more and the dreadful work is effectively done. These conditions are essential to the success of a single crime of this sort. But Catherine Wilson, who suffered death this day, had fulfilled these terrible conditions, had gone through these awful scenes not only once, but over and over again, until she became at length a skilful, resolute, and pitiless adept in this diabolical arc of death. Within her narrow circle and up to the limit of her opportunities, she was the perfect Borgia or female Palmer. It was evidently the study of her life to multiply these opportunities. She moved quietly from place to place, from one circle to another, repeating at every change the same awful tragedy. In every instance, the victims were promptly selected, gradually folded with serpentine dexterity in the coils of a fatal intimacy, and the necessary poison of confidence and control having once been secured, struck down with a stealthy and remorseless blow. The particular crime for which this guilty woman suffered was committed no less than 6 years ago, and, considering the long interval that has elapsed, and the great difficulty of obtaining definite proof in such cases, the evidence produced at the trial must be regarded as satisfactory and conclusive. It came out in the evidence that then prisoner, with a view probably to her own protection, circulated in confidence the report that the deceased Mrs. Soames had poisoned herself, and that she was privy to the fact, but did not wish to reveal. It was proved, however, that the poor woman, Mrs. Soames, as perfectly cheerful, in good health and spirits, with no motive whatever for committing such a desperate act, and he had in fact made arrangements during her short illness on the expectation of a speedy recovery. If she died by poison, as Catherine Wilson asserted, there could be no doubt as to whom had administered it. Motive. The only point remaining to be noticed is the motive of the murder, and this, as in every case of poisoning by the same hand, appears to have been money. The prisoner, Catherine Wilson, knew that Mrs. Soames had gone to her brother for money, and probably did not know how much she had actually received. But whatever it might be, she, Catherine Wilson, evidently resolved to possess herself of it, and accordingly no trace of the £9 in gold was found after Mrs. Soames's death. It appears uncertain whether she had not obtained other sums from the murdered woman. After Mrs. Soames's death, Catherine Wilson certainly obtained £10 from the daughters on the faith of a document said to be in their mother's handwriting. But it is perfectly clear that this wretched woman had become so familiar with the appalling crime of secret poisoning that the certain prospect of even a comparatively small prize would be quite sufficient to incite her to another attempt. The trial. From the Nonconformist, October 1862. Several days were occupied at the Central Criminal Court last week in the trial of Catherine Wilson for the murder by poison of Mrs. Soames 6 years ago. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. Her case is interesting as exhibiting the depth of wickedness, of cunning, and of criminal audacity to which woman's nature may sink. 8 years ago, Catherine Wilson was living as a housekeeper or servant with a gentleman who made his will in her favour, and very shortly afterwards died. Whether he died by fair means or whether his death was accelerated by the object of his bounty will never be known. There appears to be no positive evidence of his having died of poison, and charity, if charity is worth bestowing upon such an object, would willingly acquit her of such a crime. The gentleman was accustomed to taking doses of colchicum. For our listeners, colchicum was used as a painkiller and anti-inflammatory medicine, but can be lethal if not taken under controlled dosages, so that his housekeeper knew perfectly well the mode of its operation. Left in moderate comfortable circumstances by the will in her favour, she seems to have devoted her life since that period to improving the fortune and practising the lessons she had obtained from her deceased benefactor by a system of the most wholesale poisoning. Mrs. Soames, the woman of whose murder this female palmer has just been convicted, kept a lodging-house in London. To this home Mrs. Wilson came as lodger, together with a young man of the name of Dixon. They had not been there long before Dixon was taken seriously and suddenly ill. All the symptoms were those of poisoning by colchicum, and in a short time he died. His death certificate represented that he had died of consumption, but his lungs were found perfectly healthy. A short time afterwards, Mrs. Soames herself came home one evening with a loan of £9 in her pocket. It was dangerous to carry money in one's pocket when in company with Catherine Wilson. The landlady was well and in good spirits in the evening. Catherine Wilson wanted to see her in her room. She went there and stayed some time. The next morning Mrs. Soames was violently ill, again with the symptoms that would have been resulted from the use of colchicum. Medical assistance was called in. Catherine Wilson was indefatigable in her attentions. She gave her medicine, she gave her food, but the most soothing medicines and the most suitable food only seemed to aggravate the symptoms, and Mrs. Soames died. The £9 she had borrowed was not to be found, while an IOU showed that she was indebted £10 to Catherine Wilson, that she should have borrowed £10 of Catherine Wilson, or that Catherine Wilson should have had £10 to lend her, were equally remarkable. But this was found. Catherine Wilson, as the affectionate friend, hinted that Mrs. Soames had taken poison. Indeed, her head seemed to be very full of poison. The doctor suspected poison too, but had not skill enough to prove it. Catherine Wilson, however, knew a cause why Mrs. Soames should have taken poison. There was a man who wanted to marry her and had jilted her. Nobody else knew the man, and he had never been produced. There was, however, a letter from him dating just before Mrs. Soames's death. That letter was proved to be in the handwriting of Catherine Wilson. Such facts as these, with other circumstances ably summed up by the judge, left not a shadow of doubt that Catherine Wilson had committed the murder, stolen the money, forged the IOU for money lent, and fabricated the evidence by which she hoped to remove the guilt from her own shoulders. 3 years later, in 1859, we find this interesting creature with a Mrs. Jackson at Boston. Mrs. Jackson had drawn £120 out of the bank, and Catherine Wilson knew that she had drawn it. Mrs. Jackson was taken ill with the same symptoms as her former victims and died. The £120 could not be discovered, and a promissory note, which was found for the same, signed by two pretended borrowers, was proved to be a forgery. This sum seems to have set Catherine Wilson up, for next year we find her receiving lodgers, and one of these lodgers was a Mrs. Atkinson of Kirby Lonsdale, who in a short time exhibited the same symptoms as Mrs. Soames and the rest, and in a few days died. The evidence of murder in this case appears to have been very strong, for the prisoner was indicted upon it, and had she been acquitted of the murder of Mrs. Soames, would have been tried upon this charge. The judge, in passing sentence, expressed his firm assurance of her guilt. From Harper's Weekly, the 22nd of November, 1862. Mr. Justice Byles, with reference to the death of Miss Soames, stated, "We never heard of a case in which it was more clearly proved that murder had been committed, and where the excruciating pain and agony of the victim was watched with so much deliberation by the murderer." Mr. Justice Boyles went on to say that he had no more doubt but that Mrs. Atkinson was also murdered by Catherine Wilson, that if he had seen the crime committed with his own eyes. Nor did two murders comprise the catalogue of her crimes, that she, who poisoned her paramour Moore, again poisoned a second lover, one Dixon, and robbed and poisoned Mrs. Jackson, attempted the life of a third paramour named Taylor, and administered sulphuric acid to a woman in whose house she was a lodger. 7 murders known, if not judicially proved, do not, after all, perhaps complete Catherine Wilson's evil career. The execution from the Broadsides, 1862. The wretched creature had, within the last few days, become fully aware of her awful position, and paid marked attention to the exhortations of the Worth chaplain, and seemed to give way to her evil conscience. She had been ever reserved with regard to the awful crime for which she suffered, but we believe she made some communications to the chaplain. She rose early on the morning and was attended by the chaplain, when she continued in prayer for some time. She partook sparingly at breakfast, and at 7 a.m. the sheriffs arrived and immediately visited the wretched culprit, who thanked them for the kindness she received at their hands. The executioner now proceeded to pinion the prisoner. When everything being in readiness, the prisoner thanked the officials for their attention. The procession was now formed, and, headed by the chaplain, proceeded towards the scaffold. On arriving on the drop, the prisoner seemed dismayed at the immense multitude assembled, who greeted her with groans and hisses. The preparations having been completed, the signal was given and the bolt drawn, and Catherine Wilson was launched into eternity. From the Bicester Advertiser, Saturday, 22nd of November, 1862. The crowd, we should think, did not contain more than 8 or 10,000 persons. A good many of the windows commanding a view of the scaffold were without tenants. We noticed that several well-dressed women were at some of the windows that were occupied, and that the opera glasses were being used in requisition, but certainly much less educated or genteel curiosity touching Calcraft's manipulations and their results was manifested that had been displayed a month ago. It was said that £4 was being asked for a room with 3 windows on the Ludgate hillside of the gallows. We wonder if the landlords of the houses near the scaffold claim any additional rent on the ground of the very peculiar advantages which their tenants enjoy. At midnight, at least 100 persons had taken up their position near the gallows, with the view of remaining till all was over. It would not, we think, be any great libel on them to say that they were chiefly belonging to the classes who resided in the fetid court pointed out to Alton Lock by Sandy Mackay, thieves, prostitutes, or worse. Between 7 and 8 the crowd was very noisy. A band of preachers had taken up their stand on the Smithfield side of the scaffold, and in a style which resembled that of and Mr. Richard Weaver loudly exhorted all within hearing to instant repentance. The crowd as a whole behaved neither better nor worse than any other crowd of the same description had done before. Catherine Wilson has the distinction of being the last woman to be publicly hanged in London. Hers was the first death sentence handed down to a woman in 14 years. It was noted that even the societies against execution made little noise against Catherine Wilson's sentence.
Case 5. Serial Killers on the High Seas, 1903. It had all the trapping of a nautical tragedy. A vessel ablaze off the coast of South Africa, a desperate escape in lifeboats, and 7 crewmen mysteriously missing. But as the survivors of the Veronica came ashore with a tale of sudden fire and doomed comrades, something about their story didn't sit right. Why had no distress signals been sent? Why were the lost all Indian crew members? And why were the survivors so well prepared for their narrow escape?
On the 12th of May 1903, a bizarre trial opened at Liverpool of 3 men accused of mutiny, murder, arson and more on the high seas. The story begins in Biloxi, Mississippi in the United States, then wends its way to a small island off the coast of Brazil, then Lisbon, and eventually makes its way to Liverpool, where detectives attempt to pick through the facts from fiction. The trial itself regarded the violent murder of 7 crew members for what seemed to be, at best, grudging dissatisfaction as a motive. The events took place in late December 1902, but began to hit the papers in late January 1903. From the Liverpool Evening Express, 29th of January 1903. Tragedy of the sea. Alleged mutiny and murders on a bark. Mysterious affair. Terrible sufferings. 4 arrests on suspicion. A remarkable story is current in Liverpool this morning. It is said that 4 men are detained by the local police on suspicion of having mutinied on a ship at sea and murdered the captain and 6 of the crew. The men are stated to have escaped in an open boat after firing the ship, taking with them a black cook whose life they spared on condition that he catered for their wants. The police are engaged in making inquiries into the accuracy or otherwise of the report, and if they are found correct, the suspected men will be brought up in due course at Dale Street. Inquiries made by our representative this morning shows that the story has some foundation. The vessel was a large wooden barge called the Veronica of 1,167 tons gross and 193 tons net register, built in 1879 and owned by Messrs. William Thompson and Company. The captain was named Shaw. The survivor's story. The ship left Biloxi, Mississippi at the end of last year for Montevideo. The story told by the survivors who are now detained is that in the early part of December, fire was discovered to have broken out on board, and efforts were made to extinguish it, but owing to the inflammable nature of the cargo and the fact that the vessel was built of wood, the fire made rapid progress, and all efforts to subdue it were futile. Captain Shaw of the barge quickly saw that the vessel was doomed,
and accordingly on the 20th of December he ordered the 2 boats to be launched and well stocked with provisions and fresh water. The same day the Veronica was abandoned, fiercely burning from stem to stern. Captain Shaw took charge of 1 boat, manned by 4 seamen, and the second officer took charge of the second boat, manned by the other 4 seamen, as the chief officer and several seamen died before the vessel was abandoned. The second officer's boat reached Caturian Island off the coast of Nicaragua on December the 25th, with its occupants in a starving and dying condition. They were subsequently taken off the island by the Liverpool steamer Brunswick. On arrival in Liverpool last evening, the 4 men were arrested in consequence of information received, and inquiries are now being pursued by the detective staff. How the survivors were found starving on a desert island. A representative of the Express today had an interview with Captain Brown of the Brunswick, which brought the survivors of the Veronica to Liverpool. Captain Brown stated that he picked the men up at Tentoya, a small desert island off the coast of Brazil. His firm have a station on the island, and as he approached, 5 men were seen sitting on the sand. As the island is uninhabited except at such times as the vessels call, there was much curiosity as to what the men were doing there. When the Brunswick drew near, the men launched a boat and put out to the vessel and implored the captain to take them on board, as they were starving and destitute. The men explained that they belonged to the Veronica, which was burnt at sea on December the 20th, and they were the only survivors. Another boat containing the captain and first mate had left the abandoned vessel, but they had not seen her, and believed that she had been swamped. They told Captain Brown that when they left the Veronica they put 11 biscuits and a small barrel of water into the boat, but there was neither compass nor chart. They drifted for about 5 days, and on Christmas Day landed on Tentoya, off the coast of Brazil, in a starving condition, biscuits and water having all been consumed. Captain Brown heard their story and took them on board. Whatever else might be doubtful about the affair, there was no mistaking the fact that the men were starving, for they attacked biscuits and beef with the voracity of wild animals. There were 6 men in the party, 3 Germans, 1 Dutchman, 1 American, and a Negro who had been cook and steward on the Veronica, the others being able seamen. The men were treated kindly on board and were made as comfortable as circumstances permitted whilst the vessel proceeded on her voyage. The cook's sensational revelation. 10 days out of Tentoya there was a sensational development. The Negro cook intimated that he wished to see the captain privately. Captain Brown acceded to the request, and the Negro then told him that the story about the captain and the first mate having been drowned by the swamping of a boat was false. What had happened, the man said, was that the 4 of the crew, led on by the German boatswain, had murdered the captain and the mate and left the vessel. The Negro was in a frightened condition and told Captain Brown that his companions had threatened to murder him if he gave them away. Captain Brown reported all that had passed to the British consul in Lisbon, and on his instructions brought the men off to Liverpool. The Brunswick arrived in Jersey last night and docked at about 11 o'clock. Liverpool detectives at once boarded the vessel and made inquiries into the affair, with the result that all the survivors were taken to Dale Street. Decision of the police. The extraordinary statement by the Negro cook. The Liverpool magistrates have now decided to charge the 4 men in custody with wilful murder on the high seas, and probably a charge of arson will be added later. It transpires that the statement made by the Negro cook, who is a half-caste, is of even more extraordinary nature than at first supposed. He states that there was not a general rising amongst the crew, but that the 4 men now in custody made it up amongst themselves to gain possession of the ship in a quiet way. The men lay in wait in the darkness of night, and when they had an opportunity, they hit 1 man at a time on the head with a belaying pin, and while he was unconscious, threw him overboard. One of the crew was the first man attacked in this way. The captain followed, then the first mate, and afterwards the others, until 7 men had thus been murdered. It is stated that the whole thing was done in the course of 1 day and night, the men all knocked on the head and their bodies pitched overboard. It was the intention of the mutineers to take the life of the cook also, but he barricaded himself in a part of the vessel and begged hard for mercy. His barricading defeated the first attempt of the men to get at him, and his pleas apparently had some effect, for one of the men took his part, and it was finally decided to spare his life, on the understanding that the cook would act as a servant to them and obey all orders. The cook then left his barricaded stronghold and joined the mutineers. The men, having got command of the ship, knew, of course, that they could not take her into port, and it was decided to abandon the vessel and follow the roll of castaways. Preparations were made for a lengthy sea voyage in an open boat. The best lifeboat on the ship was caulked with especial care. The vessel was rummaged, and everything likely to be of value was taken. A compass was removed from the chart house, and biscuits, beef, and water were placed in the lifeboat, which was also fitted with a sail. And on the 20th of December all was ready, and that day the lifeboat was launched. A further consideration rose as to the ship, and the men decided before leaving to set her on fire. At the last moment this was done, and the cook states that as the lifeboat got away from the ship, flames were bursting out from different parts of our hull and fittings. The mutineers drifted about in their lifeboat for 5 days, and sighting the island of Teutonia, it was decided to land there. The rest of the story had been told by the captain of the Brunswick. It seemed that while on board the Brunswick on the voyage home, one of the men suggested that they should land at Oporto. The captain remarked that if the men went ashore at the place they would certainly be locked up, and no attempt at landing was made. Some misapprehension was arisen as to the number of the men implicated. It is now stated that the crew of the Veronica consisted of 12 all told. The captain and 6 others are missing and are alleged to have been murdered. 5 were landed in Liverpool, of whom 4 are charged with murder, the 5th being the Negro cook. Names of the accused. The names of the men charged are Otto Monson, Henry Fleur, William Smith, and Gustav Rau. The charge is that they wilfully murdered the captain, 2 officers, and 4 of the crew,
and subsequently set the ship on fire, and they will be brought before the police court tomorrow morning. The men are held as attempts are made to confirm the stories that have been told regarding the murders. Henry Flor, a young 18-year-old German, turns state's evidence and recounts a very similar story to the authorities. The cook's story had not been shared with the prisoners, yet young Flor's story tallies with the cook's. He is released from prosecution provided he acts as a witness against the others. From the Illustrated Police News, 18th of April 1903. The Veronica men committed. Otto Monson, Gustav Rau and William Smith were formally committed for trial at Liverpool, charged with the murder of the captain of the Veronica and the first and second mates and 4 of the crew, as well as with arson and conspiracy. Monson reserved his defence. Rau and Smith merely said, "It is not true." Evidence is gathered as attempts are made to follow the starting point of the Veronica and to understand all of the events leading to the murder of the captain and 7 of her crew. From the Liverpool Evening Express, the 12th of May 1903, the Veronica tragedy, Assizes trial begins today. Flor tells his story. The final stage in the Veronica affair was entered upon today, when the seamen who formed the central figures of the tragedy were brought up at the Liverpool Assizes. The names of the prisoners are Otto Ernst Monson, 18, a sailor; Gustav Rau, alias Augustin Mezzalin, 28, a sailor; and Willem Smith, alias Dirk Herlaar, 30, a sailor. The men are charged with the willful murder of officers and men of the crew of the Veronica, named MacLeod, Julius Parson, Patrick Doran, Abrahamson, Alexander Shaw, and Gustav Johansen and Alec Bravo, on the high seas in December 1902. They are further charged with having maliciously set fire to the British ship Veronica on the high seas, the property of Robert Thompson and another, and also with having conspired to murder the men named. The 3 prisoners looked to be in excellent health when they were placed in the dock. All 3 of them, in firm voices, pleaded not guilty to the indictment read out by the Clerk of Assize. Mr. Tobin, in opening for the Crown, said that in the middle of October last, the British ship Veronica sailed from Ship Island in the Gulf of Mexico, bound for Montevideo. She was manned by a crew of 12 hands. On the 20th of December, she was deliberately burned on the high seas and abandoned, and it was alleged that before she was burned, no fewer than 7 of the 12 hands on board met their deaths by violence. Of the remaining 5, 3 stood in the dock charged with the murder of the captain of the Veronica, and the other 2 would appear as witnesses. The Veronica had a cargo of lumber and was 186 feet in length and about 1,000 tons registered tonnage. She carried 12 crew, comprising the captain, first and second mates, cook, and 8 hands. They were all of mixed nationalities, and that might have an important bearing on the case. The alleged conspirators were 3 Germans and 1 Dutchman, while the other 8 of the crew were mixed, there being an Irishman, Swedes, a man from Prince Edward Island, and a Hindu coolie. It was a feature of the case that the men charged should all be Germans, and the men upon whom acts of violence were alleged to have committed were of different nationalities. Counsel proceeded to describe the Veronica from the ship model on the table, and proceeded with the narrative, said that for the first fortnight of the voyage all went well. After that, the three prisoners showed they were dissatisfied towards the officers. The disaffection culminated in mutiny and murder. Motive. What could be the motive for a crime such as this? It is always difficult to analyse men's minds, but it would appear that there was ill feeling between the men and their officers on account of what the prisoners considered to be unnecessary harshness on the part of those over them. So far as the evidence went, there seemed to have been no solid foundation for that feeling. They brooded over it, discussed it on the forecastle, and worked themselves up to such a pitch that they were determined to get rid of the officers and to get rid of such members of the crew as they could not trust. There was a fourth German on board named Fleur, a youth of 18 or 19 years of age. One day, while the prisoners were standing near the forecastle, Fleur joined in their conversation, and they told him, his being German, what they were going to do. Young Fleur was terrified of being asked to join them. "I cannot bear to see a pig killed. How can I kill a man?" he said. Rao, who the Crown suggested was the ringleader in this tragedy, said to Fleur, "You can choose between joining us or going overboard." Fleur could tell the court that he was overawed into joining them. Then arose the question of how and when to murder. It was resolved that the officers and crew should be picked off one by one, and the time was to be from midnight to 4 o'clock in the morning, during the first mate's watch, and at a time when Paddy the Irishman, who was to be one of the victims, would be on the lookout on the forecastle head. Paddy was to be the first to meet his death. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, the work began. Fleur was directed to kill Paddy with an iron belaying pin, but he shrank from it, and then Rao did the work. Rao said to him quite naturally, as the ship was approaching the equator, "Can you see the North Star tonight?" As Paddy was looking under the sail, Rao hit him twice with a heavy belaying pin on the back of the head and knocked him senseless. Paddy was carried into the port locker, and later on, after asking for a drink of water, he was killed by Rao. The first mate inquired for the lookout man Paddy, and was struck on the head by Rao and knocked unconscious by a belaying pin. Whether the mate at that time was dead or not, two of the prisoners threw him overboard. Captain and second mate. They had tasted blood then, and Rao and Smith, each armed with a revolver, went aft in order to carry out their purpose against the captain and second mate. 2 shots were heard, and the second mate ran wounded through the salon aft, calling out, "I am shot." Meanwhile, Fleur was told to dispatch Johansen with an iron belaying pin. He was terrified, but did strike Johansen with a wooden pin. Next, when the captain came toward the wheel, he was struck with the belaying pin and shot by Rao, as a result of which he fell back wounded to his cabin. During this time, the cook, who had been awakened by the disturbances, was terrified and barricaded his room, and at last he was compelled to come out by reason of Rao's threats. He begged for his life, and Rao told him to go and make some coffee, and they might spare him. "Don't on any account go aft," said Row, "and ask no questions." The cook made coffee, Row standing over him with a revolver, and he tasted it first to show it was not poisoned. At Row's directions, the portholes and skylight of the house where the captain and mates were confined were afterwards blocked up to prevent the officers firing through at them and getting out. There the captain and his companions were kept for some days without food and only a little water in a tin containing peas. Row opened the skylight an inch or two and ordered the captain to give him a chart, but the maid answered that the captain was too badly wounded to move. Row ordered him to move, and the captain crawled to the skylight. "What have I done?" was the piteous appeal of the captain. "I have a wife and children. Spare my life. Give me water." Row gave him water. The men determined it was not safe to leave the captain and the second mate alive, so one day Row arranged the men upon the poop, and there stood Row, Smith, and Monson armed with revolvers, and Fleur was ordered to take his part with an iron belaying pin. The second mate was ordered to come out. He came out and walked up the steps aft, but seeing the armed men standing there, he ran along the starboard side, and he was shot by Smith in the shoulder, and he then ran overboard. He swam with the energy of despair, but Row shouted, "About ship! He must not get away alive!" The three men then shot at him as he swam in the water. The captain was then ordered out, but he did not come, and the Hindu cook was ordered to go down with an axe and chase him out. The captain came up with his hands before his face, and Row, placing a pistol to his head, shot him dead, the captain falling backwards down the steps. The story. It became necessary that some explanation should be adopted in case they were picked up, and it was determined to set fire to the ship, destroy all traces of the crime, and leaving the Veronica in mid-ocean to take to the lifeboat. The story was concocted, and it was agreed to say that the crew had put out in 2 lifeboats, but what had become of the second one they did not know. That story, Row set the men to learn. They learned it day by day, but 2 of the crew were bad learners, Johansen the Swede and the Hindu coolie. He could not learn the story, so they were killed too. That left 5 men, the 3 prisoners, Fleur, and the cook. The lifeboat was caulked and amply provisioned, ready for sailing. Blood-stained clothing was placed on the lumber, and the whole saturated with oil and then set on fire. Escape. Then the lifeboat was launched, and Row, who said he had been in the German Navy, took charge of it. They sailed southeast for 5 days, and sighting land, the northeast corner of Brazil, Row ordered that all the provisions and casks should be thrown overboard, so that it might appear that they had left in a hurry and were quite destitute. The Brunswick. They landed on the island of Kajura, belonging to Hugh Vans and Company of Liverpool, and were picked up by the Brunswick, which called there. Row and the cook went on board and told the captain the story that had been agreed upon, and believing them, the captain took them on board. The cook held himself aloof from the others, and at his own request was berthed apart from them. During the voyage he saw the captain privately, and told him the story that he would tell the jury that day. The men were not allowed to land at Lisbon, and were brought to Liverpool. The prisoners' statements. 2 of the men, and afterwards Smith, made long statements to the police which were utterly inconsistent with and contradictory to
their previous story. Dealing with the statements made by the prisoners after arrest, counsel said that briefly they suggested that there was ill feeling between the men and the officers. That one night trouble arose and the first mate jumped overboard, and that afterwards the captain and the second mate were shot by the black cook. As a matter of fact, they asserted that the cook was the ringleader of the whole affair. So far as the evidence which the coroner had been able to collect was concerned, there was nothing whatever to show that he had anything to do with it at all. Henry Flor. A startling feature of the case was that after Flor had been in prison a few hours, he voluntarily made a statement that corroborated in all the main essentials the story that had previously been told by the cook to the captain of the Brunswick. Moreover, Flor had no notion whatever of what the cook had said. The Crown resolved to withdraw the charge of murder against Flor because he was a young man, 18 or 19 years of age, who might well have been overawed by minds more powerful than his own, and because it was felt that in a case of this supreme importance it was not right that the jury should be asked to decide this case on the evidence of one man. Counsel concluded his opening remarks, which lasted an hour, by pointing out that even according to the prisoners' own statements, their original story as to the burning of the Veronica was a fabrication and absolutely untrue. Witnesses were called who produced official documents and whose testifies to the correctness of the model of the Veronica. The Veronica in Biloxi. Antoine Bellond, captain of the bar pilot in Biloxi, Missouri, USA, stated that the Veronica arrived off Ship Island in ballast last August, with Captain Shaw in command. The vessel was in quarantine for 15 days. Captain Shaw was also a little deaf. Witness on board the Veronica when she was towed out in October last, Captain Shaw and the full crew, 12 all told, were then on board, including Thomas, the cook. Evidence by Henry Flor. Rowe, Smith, Monson and witness Flor were together, and a talk ensued as to how it was to start. Rowe said that Smith and me, witness Flor, were to push a knife in Paddy's throat, and Rowe would look after Julius. Then they were all to go aft, kill the man at the wheel, Johansen, and the rest of the crew. On the Monday morning after this, Smith said, "I will go now to the forecastle head and start a conversation with Paddy, and you, Flor, must follow me and put a knife into his throat." Smith went to the forecastle head, but Flor did not follow, being frightened. Rowe afterwards came up and saying, "If you don't start, I will start," and walked to the forecastle head. Rowe said to Paddy Doran, "Can you see the North Star?" Paddy stooped to look under the foresail, and Rowe hit him on the head with an iron belaying pin. Smith and Flor dragged Paddy into the port locker. The first mate then came up, and asking where Paddy was, he being the lookout man, Rowe said he must be about somewhere. The first mate looked around, and Rowe, as witnesses thought, making a mistake, hit Smith twice with the belaying pin. Smith cried out, and Rowe then hit the first mate, knocking him down. He hit the mate again, and Smith and Rowe then threw him overboard. Smith and Rowe went aft. The witness heard 2 shots. He ran aft and saw the second mate running from the direction of the first berth.
Row and Smith were close to the forward companionway, both armed with a revolver. Row told witnesses to kill the man at the wheel, and taking a wooden belaying pin, the witness struck Johansen, who was at the wheel, on the head. Johansen fell forward into the forecastle, and witness, in following, saw Row with a pistol at Johansen's chest. He did not fire it, but only threatened. The witness ran back to take the wheel and found the captain, who was very deaf, standing there. Row came up with a revolver in one hand and a pistol in the other. He threw the pin at the captain, who ducked, and then Row fired at him, and the captain crawled into his cabin. Witness afterwards spoke to Paddy crawling out of the locker, covered with blood. Paddy appealed for a drink of water to Row, who said, "All right, I'll give you a good drink. Give me that belaying pin." Witness Flor handed a belaying pin to Row, who struck Paddy on the head and killed him, the body being thrown overboard. At this time, prisoner Smith, who had blood on his head, was watching the door of the captain's cabin, having a revolver in his hand. Witness Flor was told by Row to relieve Smith while the latter had his head dressed. After breakfast, the cabin was barricaded at the direction of Row. 3 days later, Row, who wanted a ruler, a glass, and a chart, opened the captain's skylight and spoke to the second mate. Row had a revolver in his hand. Row told the captain he wanted to go to Pernambuco. The captain and the second mate were in the cabin about a week, and in the meantime the lifeboat was caulked. On the day the captain and mate were killed, Row told witness Flor to take an iron belaying pin and watch the companion door. Row called to the second mate to come out, and he did so, saying, as he passed witness, "Don't hit me." The mate rested his arms on the rail, and Smith shot him in the shoulder. The man then jumped overboard, and while he was swimming in the water, Row, Monson, and Smith fired at him. Row shouted, "'Bout ship! He must not escape!" but they lost sight of him. Row afterwards told witness Flor to shoot the captain, and witness Flor, hesitating, Row said, "The next bullet from my gun will be yours." Row sent Alex Bravo into the cabin with an axe to drive the captain out, and gave witness Flor the revolver belonging to Alfonsos, and told him to shoot the captain. When the captain appeared, witness Flor fired at him 3 times. He did not hurt him. Row then placed his pistol close to the captain's and shot him dead. His body was thrown overboard. Row afterwards dressed in the captain's clothes and used the captain's whistle. Row, Smith, and Monson made up a story in case they were picked up, to the effect that one man died in Florida and another was killed by the fall of a yard, and so on. Johansen and Bravo could not learn the story, and Row said they must be killed. Afterwards, witness Flor heard a shot, and Johansen came up crying with 2 wounds in his stomach. The next morning, witness saw Smith chase Johansen towards the galley. Catching him, Smith seized hold of him by one hand and shot him through the head. Johansen fell dead, and the body was thrown overboard. A day afterwards, Row said Alec Bravo must be killed, and he ordered witness Flor to do it. When Alec went to haul the main tack, witness followed and fired 3 times, but did not hurt him. Bravo jumped overboard, and Row fired at him in the water. Alec cried out and then sank. After this, on Row's orders, witness provisioned the lifeboat and placed wood in the cabins with tar and kerosene and the clothes. On Rao's orders, they tried to capsize the lifeboat but failed. They all got into the prepared lifeboat, and witness then noticed that the Veronica was on fire. The handkerchief produced belonged to the captain, the comb to the mate, and the clothes to prisoner Smith. Witness corroborated counsel's opening as to the events after leaving the ship. The evidence was solid and damning, with both Henry Flor, the 18-year-old German, and Moses Thomas, the American cook, independently corroborating each other's story. From the Scotsman, 15th of May 1903, the Veronica tragedy, sentence of death. The prisoners indicted were Otto Ernst Theodor or Mousson, 18, Gustav Rau, 28, alias August Malan, and William Smith, 30, alias Dirk Herlar, sailors, and the charges against them were having murdered 7 of the crew of the British sailing bark Veronica, including the captain, the mate, and the second mate, whilst on voyage from Ship Island to Montevideo. There were further charges of firing and abandoning the ship, and of conspiracy to murder, but the count specifically proceeded upon was that of the wilful murder of Alexander Shaw, captain of the ship. The reading of the evidence occupied 3 hours. The judge directed the jury that if the prisoners acted in concert with a common intention to murder, they were all equally culpable, no matter by whom the violence was used. Soon after 9 o'clock, the jury, after a quarter of an hour's retirement, found all 3 prisoners guilty, recommending Monson to mercy on account of his youth and previously good character. The judge passed sentence of death, remarking that everyone who heard the evidence must agree with the verdict. Justice at this time was swift, and the executions took place some 3 weeks later. From the Illustrated Police News, the 6th of June 1903, double executions at Liverpool. The Veronica murders hanged. Walton Jail, Liverpool, was the scene on Tuesday of a double execution of Gustav Rau, 28-year-old, and William Smith, 30, and they were hanged for murder on the high sea. A party of the crew of the British bark Veronica, led by Rau, murdered the captain and officers and some of the crew, and then threw the bodies overboard. They burned the ship and took to one of the boats, preparing their story that the Veronica had been shipwrecked and one of the missing officers and men had gone down in another boat. The mutineers found refuge on a desert isle from which they were rescued by a steamer bound for Europe. On the way home, the ship's cook, a Negro, told the real story of the plot. A third man, Monson, was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted on the grounds of his youth. After conviction, the condemned men maintained the same stolid demeanour which characterized them at the trial. They slept well, ate heartily, smoked with enjoyment, and joked with the warders. They seemed in no way depressed by their coming fate. The pastor of the Liverpool German church frequently visited the men in prison, and at first they received his attentions with amusement, but towards the last, the pastor succeeded in securing their attentive interest. No attempt to obtain a reprieve for the men was ever suggested.
Case 6. The Lambeth Poisoner, 1892. The murky world of Dr. Thomas Neil Cream left a trail of bodies in Canada, the United States, and England. Known in England as the Lambeth Poisoner, he was ultimately caught by his own greed and ego. In the wake of the disaster that was the Ripper murders of only 3 years prior, the police in this case were committed and keen, and for this episode we focus on his killings in England and the catching of the elusive Dr. Cream.
In England, Thomas Neal Cream insisted he be referred to as Thomas Neal. For this reason, there is some conflict in the papers as to how he is referred to. For the purposes of this episode, and to minimize confusion, we will be referring to him as Neal Cream. Charming, attractive, from a good family, hopes were high for Neal Cream. Instead, Thomas Neal Cream became one of the most notorious Victorian serial killers of his day. In general, his two main themes that would overshadow his actions to come would be financial greed and power, such as the power to allow life or to take it. Canada. We start our look at Neal Cream in Canada. Suspected murder count 2. In 1872, Neal Cream enrolled in McGill's Medical School. Here, he garnered a reputation with his classmates and professors as being rather wild and fond of ostentatious displays of clothing and jewellery, according to one former professor. Neal Cream graduated in 1876 with 3 incidents which would seem to be precursors for his future diabolical crimes. The first is a fire that broke out in a room he had been renting, where a skeleton was found in his bed. Neal Cream put in what was considered an excessive request on an insurance claim, which was refused. The skeleton in his bed could be explained away with his medical studies, but it is unknown if possibly he had been looking to fake his own death. The second incident was the mysterious death of his wife, Flora Brooks. Flora had died after taking tablets that had been sent to her from her husband, who was working away. No questions were asked. The third incident regarded one of Neal Cream's patients at his practice in London, Ontario. Catherine Gardner was murdered in the streets not far from the location of Neal Cream's medical practice. The murdering agent was chloroform. Coincidentally, Neal Cream's medical thesis was on the subject of chloroform. A midwife and pharmacist were blamed for her death. The United States. Suspected murder count 3. In 1880, Neal Cream opened a practice in Chicago, Illinois, conveniently located near the red light district. The bulk of his practice was performing illegal abortions for prostitutes. One of his patients, Mary Faulkner, died, but evidence was lacking to convict Neal Cream of her death, and the blame was placed onto the midwife. Another patient, Ellen Stack, died from ingesting anti-pregnancy pills given to her by Neal Cream. Cream once again escaped justice, as definitive proof of his involvement was lacking. When Neal Cream was not performing illegal abortions, he sold himself as having the ability to combat epilepsy. One of his clients was railway worker Daniel Stott. Impressed with the care of Neal Cream, Daniel Stott sent his wife to Dr. Cream for medical advice. A relationship developed between the wife and Neal Cream. Stott, who it is believed suspected the intimate relationship between the two, conveniently died on the 14th of June 1881 through the use of strychnine-laced tablets. In a move which would be his signature, Neal Cream accused the pharmacist of having added strychnine to the formula for the tablets that he had been given. Stott's body was exhumed and found to contain large amounts of strychnine. Neil Cream made a run for it and escaped back to Ontario. Here, he was caught easily and sent back to Chicago for trial, where he was found guilty partly on the evidence supplied by Stott's wife. He was sent to Juliet Prison for life. Here, he only served 10 years, possibly with a considerable amount of help from bribes, and was released on the 21st of July, 1891. England. Murder count 4. After collecting an inheritance left to him from the death of his father, Neil Cream set off for London in September 1891. The Dr. Thomas Neil Cream of before was no more. He was now 40, balding, with rumours of red-rimmed eyes tied to his consistent, self-prescribed drug use. Stories also recount of his absolute hatred of women, possibly enhanced by the assured sentencing to prison he received by the evidence given from Daniel Stott's wife. Neil Cream settled in Lambeth Street in South London. The Lambeth area, although not at the same level of misfortune as Whitechapel, was run down and filled with poverty. The mortality rate in the area ran at about 27.7% compared to the overall mortality rate of 19.3% at the time. Headaches that Neil Cream had suffered from in the past persisted and intensified. He increased his self-medication to include low dosages of morphine. He now required thick spectacles to correct his eyesight. From his early days of charming, attractive man about town, he now appeared at best as a run-down professor. Neil Cream claimed to be a doctor at the local St. Thomas's, going under the name as Dr. Thomas Neil. The area had a large community of prostitutes. Finding his victims was easy. Behaviour. Various accounts tell of Neil Cream's clear, disturbing obsession of women. He was known to carry pornographic pictures with him, which he was ready to share at any opportunity. He boasted of an elixir of his own making which combined strychnine, morphine, and cocaine, purporting its aphrodisiac effects. He continued the constant low dosages of morphine that he had self-prescribed to combat his continual headaches. The preparation. As a certified doctor allegedly attending conferences at nearby St. Thomas's Hospital, Neil Cream had no difficulty legally obtaining the poisons he used for his killings. Priest's chemist's, where he picked up everything he needed, was just around the corner. Having arrived in London in mid-September of 1891, Neil Cream was purchasing his poisons in October, according to the carefully filled ledger the chemists kept recounting all poisonous transactions. His orders included nux vomica in liquid form, which contained strychnine, and gelatine tablets, from which we know his habit of creating his own tablets with unique poisoning formulas. Neil Cream had his personal killing equipment ready. The victims. Ellen Nellie Donsworth, 19. Nellie was a known prostitute and needed the money to survive. She shared a flat with her partner near Commercial Street, of Ripper fame. On the 16th of October 1891, she informed her charwoman that she was going out to see a gentleman she had met. Nellie was seen by a friend arm in arm with a topper, a colloquial term still used today to refer to a well-to-do gentleman, in the late afternoon. Later that evening, Nellie was seen by another friend having difficulty standing and being in considerable pain. Friends helped her to her lodging house, whilst the pain Nellie experienced increased. Between uncontrollable convulsive spasms, she gasped, "That gentleman with whiskers and a top hat gave me a drink twice out of a bottle with white stuff in it." By the time a doctor was found and arrived, Nellie was almost gone. She died on the way to St. Thomas's Hospital. A post-mortem confirmed large doses of strychnine in her stomach. From the Portsmouth Evening News, the 23rd of October 1891. A Lambeth mystery. Medical evidence was given at the resumed inquest on the body of the woman Ellen Donworth, who died under mysterious circumstances at 8 Duke Street in Lambeth, to the effect that death was due to strychnine. Deceased had stated that a man from whom she received letters and money had given her some drink out of a bottle. No information could be produced as to the identity of this individual, and the jury, in returning a verdict of death from poisoning, said there was no evidence to show how the poison was administered. Mathilda Clover, 27. Mathilda was a single mother, having been abandoned by the father of her 2-year-old child, with little choice but to work the streets. Mathilda was also known as an alcoholic. Mathilda had a reputation as being a pleasant girl. On the 20th of October 1891, Mathilda was known to leave her flat in the evening to meet a gentleman named Fred. A note had been written by Fred asking her to meet him at 7:30 outside of the Canterbury, and for her to bring his written note with her. Mathilda is known to have returned to the flat around 9 p.m. with a gentleman in a top hat, frock coat and cape, quite tall and with whiskers. Around 3 a.m. the house was awoken by screams emanating from Mathilda's room. She was found naked on the bed in convulsive spasms, gagging, vomiting, and in agony. Between gasps, she relayed how she had been given pills from Fred. The pills she had been given supposedly would help prevent her from catching venereal disease. A doctor arrived, but it was too late. Mathilda was dead. In a twist that would actually help to crack the case, Mathilda's doctor, whom she had been seeing to help her with her alcoholism, completed her death certificate as having been due to delirium tremens, believing incorrectly that Mathilda had mixed his previous prescription, a relaxant, with brandy. As far as anyone outside of the police were aware, Mathilda was not one of the Lambeth poisoning victims. Rather, she was a poor unfortunate who had ultimately succumbed to her alcoholism. Respite. Neil Cream by this time had engaged himself with pretty Laura Sabatini. As an aging man, Neil Cream possibly felt he required a pretty adornment to better allow him into society. Laura knew nothing of his other activities and accepted the marriage proposal of respectable Dr. Thomas Neil, as he was known in England. Approximately 1 month after the murder of Mathilda, Neil Cream was asked to return home to receive the final disbursement of his father's property. Neil Cream was back in London on April 2nd, 1892. He continued his wooing of Laura Sabatini and family.
and by night he stalked the streets looking for prey. The attempted murder. Louisa Harvey, also known as Louisa Harris. Louisa was a prostitute and was approached by Neil Cream, who introduced himself as an American doctor practicing at St. Thomas's Hospital. Louisa recounts, he wore gold-rimmed glasses and had very peculiar eyes. As far as I can remember, he had a dress suit on and a long mackintosh on his arm. He spoke with a foreign twang and asked me if I had ever been in America. I said no. He had an old-fashioned gold watch with a hair or silk fob chain and seal. He said he had been in the army. They agreed to meet again in the evening at Charing Cross, adjacent to the embankment. When he arrived, he brought with him some pills that he insisted she take to help her complexion, stating, "You are so beautiful, but your cheeks are too pale." Louisa's testimony gives an insight to Neil Cream's approach. She states, "I walked with him to the Northumberland public house, had a glass of wine, and then we walked back to the embankment, where he gave me 2 capsules. But, not liking the look of the thing, I pretended to put them in my mouth, and when he happened to look away, I threw them over the embankment." He then said he had to be at St. Thomas's Hospital, left me, and gave me 5 shillings to go to the Oxford Music Hall, promising to meet me at 11 o'clock, but he never came. Quick-witted Louisa, who lived by her instincts, would come back to haunt Neil Cream at the inquest and trial. From the Penny Illustrated paper, the 22nd of July, 1892. Louisa Harvey. Evidence, as given before the coroner, laid stress upon the attempt Neil made to administer strychnine to her. She did not take the capsules, but he, the prisoner, was under the impression that she did, and, indeed, had said on many occasions that she had died in the street. After taking the poison, he gave her 5 shillings to go to a music hall, where he promised to meet her later in the evening. She went to the music hall, but Neil did not put in an appearance, and there would be no doubt that he believed that the poison had taken effect and that his victim was dead. More victims: Alice Marsh, 21, and Emma Shervell, 18. It is difficult to guess if Neil Cream was inspired by the double event of Jack the Ripper. The Ripper slayings in 1892 still clung over the consciousness of Victorian London. On April the 11th, 1892, Neil Cream met both Alice and Emma outside of St. George's Circus. Playing to his charm, Neil Cream was invited back to their side-by-side flats and went into Alice's snug room. Here they partook of tinned salmon and Guinness. Neil Cream kindly shared his pill concoctions, which he said prevented venereal disease, a real threat to the girls in their trade. Neil Cream left their flat around about 2 a.m. and was seen by a constable on his beat, Officer Cromley, whilst leaving the flat. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the lodging house where the girls lived was awakened by piercing screams of agony by both girls. The spasmodic convulsions and clear pain of both girls was difficult to watch. By the time an emergency wagon arrived, it was too late. Both girls were dead. An autopsy was had, and evidence of lethal strychnine poisoning was found in both girls. Scotland Yard noted the similarity to the death of Ellen Donworth some 6 months prior,
it would seem that the Lambeth poisoner had returned. From the Penny Illustrated paper, the 23rd of July, 1892. Death of two girls. Alice Marsh, 21, Emma Sherville, 18, died from poison at 118 Stamford Street. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a police constable saw a man leave the house, and long before the police knew of Neil's identity, the constable had most accurately described him as the man who left the house. A little later, he was summoned to the house and found both girls in great agony. He took both girls to the hospital. Marsh died on the way, and Sherville shortly after her admission. The letters. Throughout these murders, Neil Cream attempted to benefit additionally from his killings through blackmail. Using various aliases, he sent letters to his blackmailing victims threatening supposed knowledge of their involvement with the various murders now popping up around London. The majority of these letters were handed over to Scotland Yard, who immediately connected the similar handwriting. Requests for money tied to the Lambeth poisonings to one person. A sting operation was put into place to try to capture the blackmailer, but this failed. However, these letters would come to light in the trial. The New York detective John Haynes. One continued aspect of Neil Cream's character would seem to be his own ego. He wanted to be admired, and he wanted to show off, as was outlined by one of his professors at McGill University so many years before. Neil Cream befriended visiting retired New York police detective John Haynes. The main topic of conversation throughout London was the Lambeth poisonings. Over dinner, Neil Cream and John Haynes discussed the crime. Haynes was fascinated by Neil Cream's seeming in-depth, intimate knowledge of each of the crimes. Walking home, he pointed out the locations of the crimes and exactly how they died. This included the murder of Mathilda Clover by strychnine, the victim whose death certificate clearly stated her death to be alcohol-related and who had remained unconnected publicly with the other Lambeth poisonings. Walking further on, he showed Haynes the location of Louise Harvey's supposed death from the pills he had given her, little realizing that Louisa had thrown the pills over the embankment. The next day, Haynes went to visit a good friend of his at Scotland Yard, where he related the strange meeting he had had with Neil Cream. Connections were made and suspicions aroused. Catching the Cream. Numerous investigations sprung up. A description was had from the retired New York detective. The charwoman at Mathilda's lodging houses was approached. Her description of the man who had been seen with Mathilda matched exactly the description now held by Scotland Yard. The constable on his beat who had seen the gentleman leaving the flats of the two murdered girls was approached for a description. It matched Neil Cream's perfectly. Passport records were checked, and it was discovered that Dr. Thomas Neil was in actuality Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. The search was on for Louisa Harvey, first to see if she was dead, as described by Neil Cream, and if not, where she was and how had she survived. Around-the-clock surveillance was put into place on Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. His penchant for prostitutes was discovered quickly. An exhumation order was placed on the body of Mathilda Clover to see if she had indeed succumb to strychnine poisoning as the others, rather than the alcoholism that had been certified on her death certificate. Lastly, one of their top investigators was sent to North America to run background checks on Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. Dr. Thomas Neil Cream was arrested on July 13th, 1892. Upon searching his premises, 7 bottles of strychnine were found, along with a collection of gelatine tablets from which he could make his own tablets. From the Worcestershire Chronicle on the 3rd of September 1892, Neil committed for trial. Thomas Neil was charged on remand at Bow Street on Saturday with the wilful murder of Mathilda Clover. John Wilson McCulloch, Ottawa in Canada, said that at the beginning of March this year he made the prisoner's acquaintance at Blanchard's Hotel in Quebec. Witness was unwell at the time and the prisoner gave him some pills which he said he was going to use in London. Prisoner showed him several photographs and said one was that of a young lady to whom he was engaged. He said that her name was Florence Sabatini. He took a bottle from a box and said it contained poison, which he gave to women in capsules. He also produced a false beard, saying that he wore it to prevent identification. He said that he had lots of fun with women in London. The prisoner was formally committed for trial, charged with murdering Mathilda Clover, Ellen Donsworth, Alice Marsh, and the girl Sherville. The inquest. All of the investigations were laid out for the jury to decide whether there was enough evidence to take Dr. Thomas Neil Cream to trial. In general, Neil Cream sat immovable, listening to everything until the arrival of Louisa Harvey. Additionally, information that had been gathered from the Scotland Yard investigator sent to North America started coming in. It all painted a picture of an international serial killer. The inquest result concluded that Neil Cream had indeed administered strychnine to Mathilda Clover. He was subsequently charged with the homicide deaths of Nellie Donsworth, Alice Marsh, and Emma Sherville, and with the attempted murder of Louisa Harvey. Also, attempted extortion charges were also laid at his door. Neil Cream was sent to Newgate Prison to await trial at the Old Bailey. The trial. The evidence which had been so carefully laid out from the inquest continued to roll out at the trial. The jury actually commended the prosecution case for its careful gathering of evidence and subsequent explanations of the evidence. The trial, which had begun on the 13th of July 1892, lasted for 4 days and was exceptionally damning. Neil Cream did not stand a chance. He was found guilty by the jury in 12 minutes. Confession. From the Sunderland Daily Echo and Shipping Gazette, the 24th of October 1892, the convict Neil reported confession. A special edition of the News of the World yesterday contained the following. We are in possession to state that Thomas Neil, during an interview in jail, has stated that he did poison 3 of the 4 girls whose death he has been charged, and that his sentence was one to which he could not object. He added, however, that he did not poison Donsworth, and that up to the last moment he had a feeling that he would be acquitted of murder. Since his condemnation on Friday, he remains as impassive and cool as before. When he was taken to Wandsworth Jail on Friday night, he said, "Thank heaven, it is all over. The judge was dead against me, but perhaps that was his duty."
He is anxious that Miss Sabatini should be brought to see him during the short time he has to live. He expressed yesterday a request to this effect to his solicitor. In connection with the foregoing statement, the Press Association has ascertained that Neil is not confined to Wandsworth Jail, but that he still remains at Newgate. Beyond this, the officials in Newgate declined to afford any information. From the Penny Illustrated Paper, the 29th of October, 1892. The Condemnation of Neil. Never was the capital sentence more richly deserved than when Mr. Justice Hawkins condemned to death the murderous poisoner Thomas Neil Cream for the murder of poor Mathilda Clover, and inferentially for causing the deaths of Emma Shervell and Alice Marsh in Stamford Street, as detailed in the last issue of the Penny Illustrated Paper. The inquiries which his indefatigable solicitor, Mr. Waters, is reported to be making in America with a view to prove Neil's insanity will assuredly be in vain. If there is any madness in his criminal brain, there was undoubtedly sufficient method in his madness to render it advisable that he shall no longer cumber this earth. Neil is confined in the cell of the doomed at Newgate, and will undoubtedly be executed early in November. Mr. Justice Hawkins paid just tribute during this memorable trial to Mr. Braxton Hicks, the well-known coroner, for the exemplary clearness of his notes, and the learned judge duly praised the police for their assiduity in following and ultimately arresting Neil. It will be remembered that, though the crime was committed in Lambeth, Neil was originally examined at Bow Street, and this probably explains the decision of the prison commissioners respecting the place of execution. One lesson of this unparalleled case will certainly be that doctors, even where the greatest pressure exists, will be more careful in granting certificates of death than was in the case with regard to the unfortunate woman who Neil poisoned. The execution. On the 15th of November, Neil Cream was hanged by Billington at Newgate Prison. The capture of not only the Lambeth poisoner, but an international serial killer as well, was celebrated in the streets of London. It was noted that the largest crowd to gather at an execution since they had ceased to be public was gathered outside in the London drizzle to await the black flag of death. The appearance of the black flag was greeted with hoarse cries and cheers. The story did not quite end here, though. It was reported from Billington, the executioner, that Neil Cream, moments before the drop, had said, "I am Jack."
And so, dear viewer, we emerge once more from the shadows. 6 killers, largely consigned to the yellowing edges of history, now briefly restored to the flickering candlelight of our curiosity. Some poisoned, some plotted, some prowled the high seas, and one, perhaps, whispered secrets from the scaffold, with Canada watching. Until our next descent into the archives, mind the shadows, beware the tea, and always double-check your boarding-house landlady. This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, purveyor in misdeeds and mystery.